Chapter 1819. At this moment, the aura that the two air maidens felt as if they had encountered their natural enemy began to surge wildly. In the blink of an eye, it had increased by more than 100 times. In the face of such an aura, no matter how beautiful and gorgeous this woman was, in the eyes of others, she was absolutely hideous and dangerous. This was also what the two air maidens felt at this moment. Although this feeling made the space maiden feel uncomfortable, she only felt gratified and happy in her heart because of this. Because the more dangerous the woman was, the more it meant that her decision to perish together with the woman was correct. This meant that she would be of great help to Luo Fan if she dragged the woman here. And this was the result that she wanted the most at this moment. Let me see what this low space-time dimension world can do to me. The woman roared. As she roared, a strange power shot into the sky from her body. It turned into a mysterious light in the void and shot straight towards the huge eye in the sky. This beam of light was so intense, and its might was so terrifying. Wherever it passed, the space-time naturally collapsed. The space-time dimension seemed to have turned into plasticine that was casually rubbed and changed into various forms that the air maidens had not even dared to imagine. In this form, they erupted with unimaginably terrifying power. They were wrapped by the mysterious light and shot into the sky, straight into the huge eye. At this moment, there seemed to be a subtle change in the emotions in the eye. However, this change was too subtle. It was too mysterious. Even the air maidens could see it clearly. They could even describe the slightest change in it. However, they did not know what the change was. They did not know what kind of change this represented in the emotions of the owner of the eye. Right at this moment, an earth-shattering sound of thunder suddenly rang out. As the thunderclap rang out, the ray of mysterious light suddenly flew out of the eye as if time was flowing in reverse. It charged straight at the woman who was enveloped by the eye. This charge, it directly covered the woman. This caused the woman to let out an earth-shattering scream. As she screamed, the woman's body completely collapsed, turning into countless tiny fragments that the two air maidens could not see clearly. Unfathomable existences flew in all directions. However, before the two air hostesses could show any joy, the woman's figure condensed again and appeared in her original position. At this moment, the mysterious light had completely disappeared. "It's not that simple," she shouted, and the space-time dimension around her quickly changed. In an instant, an unknown number of billions of her appeared in this area, and every single one of them was the real deal. She had a body of flesh and blood, not an illusory figure or an image condensed from power. Every single one of her powers was the power of her main body. Each and every one of them emanated a might that could shake the heavens and earth. After they appeared, the surrounding space-time dimension seemed to have suddenly been overlaid with billions of layers, suddenly becoming many times stronger. Boundless power that was countless times stronger than before was constantly released at this moment, transmitting all kinds of mysterious waves in all directions. They constantly rushed upwards, and poured straight into the huge eye in the sky. This process made the huge eye seem as if it had suffered the most terrifying impact. Countless cracks instantly appeared on the eye, showing that countless layers of spiderwebs were overlaying the eye. This change caused the entire world to shake violently at this moment. It was as if this part of the world had turned into a small bottle and was being shaken by a huge hand. In an instant, countless living beings in the world were shocked. Among the living beings, there were even many powerful supreme martial emperors who cast their gazes over from all directions, looking at the space in the sky. There were even true saints who sensed something, and there was a hint of schadenfreude on their faces, as well as an inexplicable sense of worry. Although they did not know what the world was going through, they knew that this was definitely some kind of change that would shake the foundation of the world. For them, who had suffered a lot in this world and felt that the world had become their nemesis, such a change would naturally give rise to the idea of schadenfreude. However, at the same time, they did not forget that they were in this world at this moment. In this case, if any changes were to occur in this world, if the area affected was too large and the impact was too great, they would also be affected and affected. This naturally made them feel inexplicably worried. Under these various complicated conditions, the true saint's disciples began to rush towards this spot from all directions. They surrounded this area and watched the changes in this area. This area had been separated from the outside world due to the effect of the will of heaven and earth. All the changes in this area would not affect or cause any damage to the outside world. However, it would not affect the outside world at all, nor would it cause any damage to the outside world. Therefore, to the living beings in the outside world, they could only faintly sense everything that was happening here. With their naked eyes, this place was empty. Even the space that originally existed here seemed to have completely disappeared, as if it had never existed in the first place. And this, as a result, even though they were surrounding this region, they looked like they were facing each other. The distance between them had shrunk by trillions of times compared to the actual distance between them. As the true saint's disciples gathered here, the other supreme emperors had also sensed the source of the change. One by one, they gathered here. Amidst such a gathering, all of their faces were filled with an inexplicable sense of shock. To separate the world, what kind of mighty power is this? Some supreme emperors exclaimed. If this was an ordinary world, even if the world was completely destroyed, they would not be so emotional and shocked. However, don't forget, this world was completely different from other worlds. This world was different. However, even an existence like Luo Fan, the creator of this world, who had passed through the 8th Great Tribulation of the world, would not be able to obtain any more authority in this place. He would not even be able to control this world as he pleased like before. If one wanted to destroy such a world, it would be impossible. It would require the absolute strength of supreme emperors like them. It was extremely difficult to split apart. It went without saying that, given their cultivation level, they could not even imagine what kind of power it would take to achieve this. As such, it was only natural for them to exclaim in admiration. At this moment, the world shook a few more times. Indistinctly, there was a crackling sound coming from the depths of this world. In the blink of an eye, all the living beings in this world who could sense the great Tao felt that countless fine and dense cracks had appeared on the great Tao of heaven and earth. These cracks were all over the great Tao, almost enveloping it. There was an unknown amount of destructive power seeping out from these cracks. This scene was so tragic that the expressions of all the living beings who could sense the great Tao changed drastically. Indescribable fear surged in their hearts. Hurry up and strengthen the great Tao. Do you really want the great Tao to be completely destroyed? At this moment, a disciple of a true saint shouted. Although this disciple of a true saint was much weaker than the supreme emperors in terms of cultivation level, they all had an obscure aura that the supreme emperors could not understand or sense. This kind of aura made it so that even though their cultivation levels were higher than theirs, they did not dare to ignore their words. Now that they were reminded, all of them came to their senses and did not dare to be careless. They used their own power, their own comprehension, their own principles, and their own life essence to use all sorts of strange and mysterious methods to support the great Tao of the world. This kind of strengthening was naturally a drop in the ocean for the great Tao. It was impossible for it to become the main force of the restoration of the great Tao. However, this was the best help they could think of for the great Tao. In addition, this was also a kind of help. With so many cracks in the great Tao, having this help was better than not having it at all. Among the many blessing methods, the strongest and most effective one was the one that appeared in the nearest area at this time. It was the blessing method of the few true saints. Their cultivation levels were not too high, and although their enhancement methods were much more powerful than ordinary cultivators, it was only a small matter. It would not change their essence. However, their biggest advantage was that they had the magic treasures that the true saint had bestowed upon them. Although the power of these magic treasures in their hands was quite ordinary and could not fully display their advantages, that was only when they were in their hands. In fact, Although the essence of these magic treasures could not compare to that of a true saint, they were already many times stronger than the essence of Luo Fan. Such an existence used its essence to strengthen the great Tao. It easily suppressed the strengthening of the great Tao from other level 3 supreme emperors. In the blink of an eye, they stood out from the crowd of cultivators. This made their positions more conspicuous than ever among the crowd of cultivators. It was unknown how many cultivators looked at them from all directions. However, this was obviously not the time to talk nonsense. At this time, the changes in the great Tao of heaven and earth were still continuing. Naturally, it was impossible for the great Tao to collapse from a single impact. Although cracks had appeared, the great Tao's ability to repair itself still existed, and it continued to condense at all times. The cracks were constantly mended, and, in the process, the cracks were constantly decreasing. And it was also the main force that repaired the cracks. It was because of the existence of the great Tao's ability to repair itself. These cracks did not expand to the point of destroying the great Tao completely. Otherwise, with just the help of the cultivators in this world, the great Tao of heaven and earth would have already collapsed and been destroyed, since the great Tao could continuously repair itself. The power that destroyed the great Tao was also constantly being produced. It was constantly affecting the great Tao. This caused the cracks on the great Tao to reappear and expand. Gradually, it was changing in the direction of completely destroying the great Tao. Just like that, it formed a seesaw situation, and it caused more and more living beings in this world to sense it. It also caused more and more living beings with sharp senses to fall into the panic of the end of the world. These indescribable emotions were the methods that the cultivators used to deal with them. Although they could not directly affect the great Tao, they gradually passed through some indescribable and mysterious channel to a certain location and were understood by some vast will. Gradually, in that part of the space-time that had been split apart, the huge eye floating in the void finally underwent an inexplicable change. Due to this change, the terrifying pressure that was originally locked onto the two air hostesses gradually dissipated. At the same time, the pressure on the woman in the middle started to rise. At this moment, the scene inside was the woman transforming the space-time dimension into who knows how many billions of bodies. Each body also controlled extraordinary and unimaginably terrifying power. The terrifying power continuously attacked the huge eye above. As the pressure gathered, the operation of the woman's space-time dimension suddenly became a little chaotic. In an instant, who knows how many women completely collapsed, and most of the space-time dimension instantly fell into chaos. In the end, the billions of women gradually decreased, and before they knew it, they had turned into 18, appearing in a strange posture in the center. This seems to contain some kind of mystery. An inexplicable feeling instantly appeared in the air hostess' heart. In her eyes, the postures, positions, movements, and even the subtle changes of the bodies of the 18 women in the center at this moment contained all sorts of mysterious mysteries that could not be described with words. And this mystery even vaguely involved the transformation of the space-time dimension. It made her feel as if she had a deeper understanding of the space-time dimension just by looking at it. She seemed to have said something about a low space-time dimension. At this moment, the air hostess in the other space-time dimension muttered. Her words instantly woke up the air hostess, making her recall everything that had happened before. That's right, I heard it too. Looks like she should be a living being from the so-called high space-time dimension, the air hostess said with a frown. At this moment, she felt that it was even more troublesome. No matter how she thought about it, there was an absolute difference between a low space-time dimension and a high space-time dimension. Coupled with the various unimaginable means that this person had displayed and the various unimaginable powers that she had used, she had reason to suspect that the difference between the low space-time dimension and the high space-time dimension was probably unimaginable. What's going on with this world? Putting aside the chaotic state, the great world, the perfect world, the great thousand worlds, the medium thousand worlds, and the small thousand worlds, Why is there still such a division between the low space-time dimension and the high space-time dimension? Even the calm air hostess could not help but lose her composure at this moment. Just what kind of profound mystery did the space-time dimension involve? After so many transmigrations, she had a rough understanding of it. Under such circumstances, she was told that there was an existence of a higher level above, and that existence seemed to be her enemy. One could imagine how uncomfortable that feeling was. Regardless of the changes in the two air hostesses' thoughts, a battle broke out between the woman and the will of the world on the other side. Although the woman's hundreds of millions of bodies have been suppressed to the point that there were only 18 of them left, just the wonderful structure that these 18 bodies formed was already emitting almost half of the aura of the previous hundreds of millions of bodies. The terrifying pressure soared into the sky from the book and directly charged towards the huge eye. Through the changes in the space-time dimension, it suppressed the eye, causing cracks to appear on the eye, and the cracks kept healing under the effect of its own power. All of a sudden, the light in the eye froze slightly. In the blink of an eye, a colorless bolt of lightning descended from the sky, slashing down. This lightning was so mysterious and so terrifying. As it struck down, time and space completely collapsed and was destroyed. All power seemed to have no power in front of it, as it was completely minced apart. Even the space-time dimension was in complete chaos under this power. For a time, it was unknown how many chaotic lights and shadows appeared where the lightning flashed. These countless lights and shadows were unpredictable, and as they clashed with each other, many of them even made the two air hostesses feel an inexplicable sense of familiarity. It was a scene from a different space-time dimension. At this moment, such a horrified thought flashed through the hearts of the two air hostesses. They had seen many scenes from a different space-time dimension, so they should not be so shocked. However, don't forget that this was just a bolt of lightning casually struck down by the will of the world. Chapter 1820. Rumble. An earth-shattering thunderclap suddenly erupted. That bolt of lightning had already struck the bodies of the 18 women. The women's bodies exploded with a loud bang. This time, however, they were no longer as calm as before. At this moment, countless strange lights and shadows erupted from where the women were. The countless lights and shadows were so mysterious and strange that they vaguely resembled the scenes of the countless space-time dimensions that had been triggered by the lightning. It was as if they were scenes from different space-time dimensions. However, even though the scenery of these space-time dimensions was intrinsically familiar to the two air maidens, their appearance was completely unfamiliar to them. It was as if they had never been to these space-time dimensions that were completely different from the space-time dimensions that they had been to before. At this moment, the huge eye in the sky was still flickering. Bolts of lightning were produced in an instant and descended from the sky, frantically striking the countless lights and shadows produced by the women's explosions. In other words, they were the scenes of countless space-time dimensions. As the terrifying rumbling sounds reverberated, countless terrifying fluctuations spread out in all directions. During this process, the space-time that had been split apart was constantly undergoing indescribable and terrifying changes. Although this wasn't considered small, it was insignificant compared to the entire world. However, during this process, it began to expand crazily. And this expansion wasn't just a proportional expansion of the original space-time. Instead, it was as if the space-time was forcibly embedded into this area. Under this expansion, the two air hostesses felt as though their bodies were under immense pressure, as though their bodies were about to be compressed and shrunk. At this moment, they seemed to have lost all their strength and turned into ordinary mortals, facing the drastic changes of the world. That kind of powerlessness, that kind of feeling where they could only drift along with the wind, caused an indescribable and complicated feeling to surge up in their hearts. You want to get rid of me just like that? A loud voice reverberated in the entire area, or rather, in the entire space-time. This sound seemed to be formed by the accumulation of countless sounds, even though it was just one sound. But if one were to distinguish it specifically, one could completely hear the signs of countless tiny sounds combining together. As the changes occurred, 18 regions within this space-time started to stabilize. They were like the sea stabilizing divine needles that stabilized the ocean. It directly stabilized the chaotic space-time stacking process in the surroundings. The originally chaotic order was gradually stabilized. The originally chaotic scene gradually took on an indescribable pattern. From the looks of it, it no longer looked like a space-time that was forcefully embedded in that space-time. It was as if time and space were constantly being derived from the original time and space. That kind of power was incomparably powerful to the two air maidens. At this moment, the pressure that came from both their bodies and bodies seemed to have decreased by an unknown amount. Vaguely, they were already able to endure it. Under such circumstances, the feeling that they had turned into mortals and could only drift along with the wind had already gradually diminished. The feeling of power once again emerged from the bottom of their hearts. For powerful beings like them, the only thing that they couldn't control was chaos. As long as there was order, no matter how dangerous the environment was, no matter how dangerous the surroundings were, they would be able to find a way to resist and control it. This was the case at this moment. However, although they had already recovered their powerful aura, their expressions were extremely ugly. That was because this situation represented a fact. That woman who was suspected to be from a higher space-time dimension didn't suffer much damage. She actually relied on some unimaginable means to withstand the attack of the world's will. What did this mean? It went without saying. How could they be happy because of this? At this moment, the 18 regions that froze this space-time began to gradually shine. The space-time dimension began to gradually outline and construct itself. In just a short while, it had already turned into 18 figures. 18 figures that looked almost the same as the woman from before. Are all existences from a higher space-time dimension like this? At this moment, such a thought flashed through the two air maidens' minds. That woman's construction method clearly showed that her essence was a space-time dimension. In other words, the original formless space-time dimension that was just an illusory concept formed the foundation of her existence, the essence of her existence. How is this possible? The two of them didn't dare to believe their guesses. They exchanged looks and saw disbelief in each other's eyes. Through this disbelief, they confirmed that the other had the same thoughts as them. They couldn't help but believe that it was a possibility. At this moment, that woman didn't allow the attacks of the world's will to endlessly bombard her. With a soft cry, each of her raised her head to look at the eye formed by the world's will. Then, each of them raised their hands, and an indescribable radiance shone from their hands. This kind of light was so mysterious and profound. The color itself was so mysterious that it couldn't be described with words. Under this radiance, one could vaguely see eyes appearing on their hands. These eyes also contained deep emotions that countless creatures couldn't understand. It was also because of this incomprehensibility that made them incomparably cold, as though they didn't have any emotions or rationality. After these eyes appeared, bolts of lightning shot out from them and fused together in the void, turning into a long spear that brazenly stabbed at the huge eye in the void. At this moment, the entire space-time that was originally separated began to violently tremble and constantly change. The countless space-time that was embedded in this space-time began to collapse and shrink. As a result, the two air hostesses gradually felt an indescribable sense of relief. Their strength seemed to be recovering at an indescribable speed. They were constantly improving. This was a misconception caused by the reduction of the pressure. The appearance of this misconception made the two of them feel even more solemn, and their estimation of that woman became even higher. "I definitely won't just watch from the side," the air lady suddenly cried out. Along with this cry, countless spiritual lights emitted from her body and turned into a long river in the void. In an instant, it condensed into a seal that was entwined with countless mysteries of space-time. Crossing the void, it split into 18 and smashed down on the 18 women. Boom, 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 boom. Amidst terrifying sounds, the seals broke through the barriers of countless space-time and smashed onto the woman's head. The woman's body shuddered, but that was all there was to it. After the trembling, her expression didn't change, and she didn't even turn a look at the air lady. It was as if her attack was just a leaf falling on her head. It was just like a leaf falling on her head. It didn't cause any psychological changes at all. Faced with this situation, an indescribable pain appeared on the air lady's face. With a loud roar, she didn't stop moving and continued to condense the seals that smashed towards the woman. However, compared to the previous time, she made some adjustments to the seal. It contained the eternal indestructibility. Compared to before, the feeling of indestructibility was much stronger. Compared to before, the power that erupted from it was much stronger. It was also much stronger. Under this kind of impact, it was like a perfect world. Both of them would definitely receive quite a bit of shock and suffer quite a bit of damage. However, at that moment, the woman only trembled slightly, not to mention being injured. Even her complexion did not change in the slightest. Perhaps it wasn't that she didn't change, but she was annoyed. It was as if she was annoyed when flies kept flying in front of her. Boom, 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 boom. In the void, the giant eye that was formed by the will of heaven and earth surged with countless bolts of lightning like a swarm of clouds, and they collided with the spear that was stabbing towards it. The terrifying, squeezing force produced an intense, crushing force at this moment. As it was pushed, it erupted with an earth-shattering impact. The resulting waves turned into the effects of countless space-time dimensions that spread wildly in all directions. At this moment, the entire world began to shake violently. The speed at which the cracks appeared in the great Tao suddenly sped up, as if it was suddenly enduring a much stronger impact than before. As the cracks grew faster, the cultivators who used all sorts of methods to support the great Tao and help it resist the crisis of shattering were directly bombarded by a terrifying impact. All of a sudden, they felt a terrifying tremor from inside out, and they couldn't help but spit out blood. There were even many bodies that exploded, turning into the finest fragments that splattered in all directions. If it was a normal situation, even if they turned into such fragments, they could easily condense them again. After all, they were existences that surpassed the false sage stage, so it wasn't difficult for them to do this. However, at this moment, this impact came from the great Tao, and it was an impact that even the great Tao couldn't completely repair. Under such circumstances, they had completely lost the possibility of being reborn. They had completely perished and could not be any more dead than they already were. This kind of death was a conceptual death. The conceptual immortality had no effect at all. In fact, because of this concept of immortality, the memories of all living beings gradually faded and disappeared with the passage of time. According to this trend, it wouldn't be long before the memories of all living beings in this universe would completely disappear and they would no longer exist. This way of death was truly unimaginably cruel. However, at this moment, many cultivators were no longer in the mood to pay attention to the dead cultivators. At this moment, they were more concerned about the changes that were happening to the great Tao. If they couldn't stop this change, what awaited them would be death. Compared to the cultivators who had died now, it was just a step faster or a step slower. What was the essential difference? No matter what kind of hardships the cultivators outside were experiencing, no matter what kind of determination they had, at this moment, in the separated space-time, the battle between the woman and the will of the world had become even more intense. The space-time that had been expanded by an unknown number of times had been completely scattered at this moment. All the laws, all the four basic existences, they had all become extremely chaotic. The space-time dimension that was originally invisible now had an unprecedented sense of existence. It seemed to have turned into a real power that started to appear in this area. Or rather, this chaotic space-time started to change crazily, producing all kinds of incredible effects that bombarded the huge eye above. The huge eye wasn't inferior at all, although it was at a disadvantage because it couldn't move at will. As its power surged, countless mysterious changes were produced. Countless changes in power also involved the changes of the space-time dimension. The power that erupted wasn't inferior to the woman's attack. They destroyed each other, but they weren't truly defeated. During this, although the Sky Maiden tried her best to attack the woman with her own means, her attacks seemed to be lacking a dimension. However, her attacks seemed to always be lacking a dimension. She was unable to truly affect the woman, nor was she able to do anything to the woman. It was as if she was doing something useless. This situation continued as time went on. In the beginning, the situation seemed to be very disadvantageous to the will of the world in this space-time. The will of the world might be completely destroyed by the woman's attacks. Even the entire world would disappear and turn into dust, but this was only the beginning. As time passed, the will of the world mobilized more and more of the power of the world, and the changes of the space-time dimension that it displayed also became more and more mysterious. The use of the characteristics of the space-time dimension also became more and more casual. As it became more and more proficient, the situation gradually changed. The woman's means were profound, and the changes of the space-time dimension were so mysterious that even the Sky Maiden couldn't understand them. They were also much stronger than the will of the world. However, she was only a cultivator, a woman. She could defeat a colossus in a short battle, but if this went on for a long time, she would definitely be at a disadvantage in terms of endurance and endurance. In other words, this woman was destined to fail when she was unable to destroy the will of the world at the first possible moment. The only difference was the length of time. As time passed, the two air hostesses gradually realized this point. In the end, at a certain moment in time, Space Maiden let out a long sigh of relief, and she finally stopped her futile attacks. She could see clearly that even without her attacks, the world would still be able to obtain victory. The woman's defeat was already destined. Seeing that she had stopped attacking, the Sky Maiden said calmly, "You're finally willing to give up? Why do you have to do such a useless thing?" The Sky Maiden was the only one who had been attacking the woman over the past few days. The Space Maiden from a different space-time dimension did not attack. She just watched from the side. "If this happened in your space-time dimension, I think you would do the same," the Sky Maiden said calmly. The biggest difference between her and Space Maiden in a different space-time dimension was that this was her space-time dimension. Her cultivation partner, Luo Fan, was here. Thus, even though she knew that her attacks were insignificant and might not even affect her opponent in the slightest, she would still use all her strength to attack the woman. She wanted to do her part for the victory of the space-time dimension, as well as for her cultivation partner. This wasn't rational, but it was driven by the emotions in her heart, and she had no choice but to do so. In comparison, the Sky Maiden from the space-time dimension was basically the same person as the Sky Maiden. However, this wasn't her space-time dimension, and her cultivation partner didn't exist here. Thus, she was more rational and could maintain a detached state of mind. When she felt that her attacks wouldn't be of any use, she stopped attacking. The Sky Maiden from the space-time dimension fell silent for a while when she heard the Sky Maiden's words. Then, she nodded and said, "That's right. If this was really my space-time dimension, my actions wouldn't be too different from yours." There wasn't much meaning in denying such things. This was especially true for an existence that could almost be considered as another self. Time passed slowly. In the blink of an eye, more than 1,000,000 years had passed. On this day, the woman from the space-time dimension let out an extremely resentful and regretful roar. Finally, she couldn't bear the crushing pressure from the will of the world. With a bang, she was pressured and attacked by the terrifying power, and herself completely collapsed. She turned into space-time dimensions and mixed together, forming a figure that was frozen in space-time. A figure that looked like an ice sculpture that had been frozen in ice. Chapter 1821. This aura was so vast and supreme. After it appeared, the entire heaven and earth seemed to have regained its vitality. All the damage and exhaustion began to recover rapidly. Even the space that had been separated and formed an independent body, but was ultimately destroyed in the battle, started to recover rapidly as if time was flowing backwards. In this space-time, a wisp of the substance of the space-time dimension gradually appeared and gradually transformed into a woman. It was a woman who looked the same as before, but her essence was many times different. The Space Maiden felt that she could crush this woman with one finger. After the woman appeared, she looked a little lost at first. Then, she felt extremely pained, and her eyes were filled with indescribable resentment. Due to these changes, the huge eye in the void that was formed by the will of the heaven and earth gradually disappeared. In the end, it completely disappeared and returned to the strange place where it had always been. However, at this moment, the Space Maiden was no longer in the mood to care about anything else. At this moment, her entire body was filled with an indescribable joy. This was because she could clearly feel that this aura was Luo Fan's aura. In her opinion, this meant that Luo Fan had already passed through the second tribulation. How could she not be happy? How could she not be excited? Even heaven and earth had undergone such changes. The cultivators who had been severely injured while protecting the Great Path were no exception. Naturally, he was no exception. Similarly, he had obtained sufficient benefits from his process. His injuries recovered quickly, and the damage to his essence was quickly repaired. Every surviving cultivator felt like they were at least a notch stronger than before. However, this was only the case for the surviving cultivators. The dead cultivators. But he was completely dead. They could no longer recover. This was undoubtedly a huge pity. This aura. Among the cultivators, the disciples of the True Sage sect had a complicated look on their faces. That's right. It's his aura. I didn't expect to disappear in such a short time. He has already grown to this level. Xiao Daozi sighed at this moment. Although it had been tens of millions of years since they last met, this period of time could really be considered to be extremely short in the eyes of existences like them. That was why they sighed with emotion. Perhaps this is the benefit brought about by him opening up the world. Qing Longzi also sighed. Forget it, let's disperse. Since he's already back, he'll take care of everything in this world. Another true divine disciple sighed and turned to leave. The other true sage disciples looked at each other. All of them made a prompt decision and turned around to leave. Throughout the entire process, they completely ignored the others who had helped the world along with them. Those supreme emperors. However, the supreme emperors were no longer in the mood to care about them. None of the supreme emperors had as much foundation as the disciples of the true saints. To them, this kind of situation was to them. The insignificant changes to the disciples of the true saints were a great opportunity. Through such changes, they could comprehend the profound mysteries of the world itself. They could sense the profound principles contained in the changes of the great Tao of the world. From there, they could comprehend countless mysteries that were beneficial to their cultivation. They could either strengthen their foundations or improve their intrinsic qualities. How could they miss such an opportunity? The space-time gradually returned to its original position, continuously pushing everyone away from each other, causing the distance between them to grow further and further. At the same time, waves of dense pneuma started to be released from that position. This pneuma was completely different from the pneuma that originally existed in the world. It contained more mysteries of space-time. As the pneuma spread out, it caused the space-time dimension of the world to undergo subtle changes. It seemed to have become more substantial and seemed to have obtained some kind of ability that it originally did not have. This pneuma did not come from anywhere else but from the lady. The mysteries of space-time contained within came from the lady's intrinsic qualities. It was the mysteries of the higher space-time dimension. Although the lady was still alive, she had indeed died in the battle with the will of the world. This death caused the essence of her existence to be completely integrated into the world and absorbed by the will of the world. This death had caused the essence of her existence to fuse with the world and be absorbed by the will of the world. In other words, she was no longer a living being that had descended from the higher space-time dimension. Instead, she had become a living being that was born from the world itself. In other words, she was no longer a living being that had descended from a higher space-time dimension. Instead, she had become a living being that was born from this world itself. It was precisely because of this that there was such a huge difference in strength between them. This was also the reason why there was such a huge difference in strength between her and the will of the world. The yuan qi that was constantly being released and dissipated into the entire world was the yuan qi produced by the mysterious fusion of the higher space-time dimensions. This pneuma contained the principles of the higher space-time dimension. If a living being could comprehend it calmly, they would definitely be able to obtain some of the mysteries of space-time from it. Even for the many supreme emperors in the surroundings, this pneuma was quite effective. It was enough for them to clearly sense the principles of space-time and the mysteries of space-time. Perhaps some supreme emperors would be able to comprehend some of the mysteries of space-time through the pneuma. However, all of this was meaningless to the air hostess and the others. At this moment, the air hostess's expression had already become somewhat worried. This was because she realized it was the aura that belonged to Luo Fan. When it was released, it enveloped the world and stimulated the world to produce all sorts of mysterious changes. However, it did not change much. It was as if the aura was just a dead object. Or perhaps, the owner of the aura seemed to have fallen into a deep sleep or was in a sealed state. Such a change. It was very different for what she had previously expected. How could she not be worried? Do you think he has already woken up? Don't even think about it. He has only passed a small hurdle. At this moment, the woman who had just been resurrected sneered. The air hostess furrowed her brows. The various actions of the woman from before appeared in her mind, and a wave of anger rose in her heart. In an instant, she raised her hand and grabbed. Waves of spiritual light formed a palm in the void and grabbed the woman. During this process, the woman felt that something was amiss and tried her best to resist. She wanted to mobilize the power of the surrounding space-time dimension to resist the grab. However, it was a pity. Although she still had a trace of the power to mobilize the space-time dimension, she could no longer unleash that powerful and terrifying power as freely as before. However, the mobilization of such power was clearly nothing to the air hostess. Thus, she could not resist at all and was directly grabbed by the spiritual light palm. In an instant, she had already arrived in front of the air hostess. The sudden change made the woman feel indescribably humiliated. Her face flushed, and her eyes were filled with indescribable resentment and pain. It turns out that without that method, you're nothing more than this, the air hostess said faintly. Sensing the woman who was constantly struggling but unable to break free from her grasp, the air hostess could not help but feel an indescribable pleasure in her heart. Even an air hostess would feel intense emotions when she suddenly turned the tables after suffering all kinds of powerlessness. At this moment, the eyes of the air hostess from a different space-time dimension burned. There was curiosity, joy, and even eagerness in her eyes. Although she came from a different space-time dimension, they were both air hostesses, and there was not much difference in their thinking. "What did you mean by that?" the air hostess asked. "Do you want to get an answer from me with that attitude of yours?" The woman said coldly. Although she had fallen into a situation where she could not resist, the pride in her heart still made her unwilling to put down her airs and lower herself to the point of bowing and scraping to the air hostess. The air hostess snorted. In an instant, a wave of power poured into the other party's body and exploded with a loud bang, causing her body to turn into strands of space-time dimension that drifted in all directions. It's actually made up of space-time dimension? The air hostess from a different space-time dimension exclaimed at this moment. At this moment, the strands of space-time dimension rapidly condensed and finally formed the woman's appearance again. However, this time, her face was as pale as a sheet of paper, and there was not a single trace of blood on her face. Her body was even trembling nonstop, as if she was enduring boundless pain. Looking at this scene, it was obvious that the resurrection was not easy or complete. At this moment, there was an indescribable pain on the woman's face. This pain was not only brought about by the resurrection of her body, but also by the difference in strength between her and the other party. "You've already set up your previous self," the air hostess said faintly. "Do a few more times." I seem to be able to comprehend some of the mysteries of space-time dimension from the process of her resurrection. The air hostess from a different space-time dimension urged. The air hostess seemed to be tempted. This reaction made the woman's expression change slightly. She said, "You can try again." "Really?" The air hostess frowned and immediately raised her hand to do it again. The woman gritted her teeth and said, "Humph. If you do it again, I won't be able to resurrect, and my body will definitely explode. By then, this world might have a chance to recover, but you guys will definitely die." "I don't believe you." The air hostess shook her head. "Even if you don't believe me, you should believe the owner of that aura." The woman's expression had already calmed down, and she said faintly, "What do you mean?" The air hostess frowned. The owner of that aura was naturally Luo Fan. What matter was related to Luo Fan? She could no longer remain indifferent. "Why do you think he suddenly woke up in the process of transcending the tribulation and poured his power into the aura to resurrect me?" the woman said faintly. The air hostess expression suddenly became a little hesitant. If one looked at it from this angle, this was indeed worth pondering. After all, if Luo Fan was currently in the midst of transcending the tribulation, even if he had already passed a small stage, he should be doing his best to deal with the next stage. Why would he release his aura to repair this world and even resurrect the woman in front of him? Could it be? Was what she said true? Did Luo Fan really do that because of the serious consequences of her death? The woman said faintly, "He detonated the space-time dimension because of my death. In the end, at least 1/10 of this world was destroyed, and only then did he resurrect me." After saying this, she fell into silence. She was confident that this was what she had said. The other party would no longer have the idea of completely erasing her. Since he was not erased, then she no longer had any worries. "How should I address you?" the air hostess from another space-time dimension asked. They had met for such a long time, which could even be calculated in tens of thousands of years, but the woman had never told her what her name was. The woman said faintly, "Wamiao. You can call me Saint Wamiao." Before this, the woman had completely looked down on the living beings from this low space-time dimension. In her eyes, the air hostess and the others were completely existences like ants. Naturally, she was not in the mood to tell them her name. But now, her strength had been reduced to the level of an ant. Under such circumstances, even if she was extremely arrogant and thought that the air hostess and the others were still ants and were still countless times weaker than her, she could no longer turn this mentality into action like before. Therefore, she could only tell them her name. "Saint Miao, this name is a little strange." The air hostess from another space-time dimension frowned and said. She was a quick-witted person. Just this name alone was enough for her to analyze many problems. Saint was like an honorific title. Behind it, there was obviously a complete honorific system. What other titles were there after that? What strength did they correspond to? Were there any honorific titles that were at the level of a true sage or even far beyond a true sage? All these doubts and thoughts made the air hostess from another space-time dimension fall silent. "Well, meow, perhaps what you said is true. However, you have to admit that I'm stronger than you now," the air hostess said faintly. "Perhaps I can't kill you right now, but it won't be a problem for me to make you suffer or even seal you," the air hostess said faintly. Well, Meow's expression turned a little ugly when he heard that, although he was unwilling to admit it. What the air hostess had said was the truth. For existences at their level, as long as they were not dead, they could recover from any injuries. Even if they were sealed, they could fully recover in a short period of time as long as they could escape. Therefore, she would not be harmed in any fundamental way. However, not being harmed in any fundamental way did not mean that she would not suffer. It also did not mean that the air hostess could not seal herself for millions or billions of years. If she was more ruthless and sealed herself until the world was destroyed, then Meow's expression turned even uglier when she thought of this. "What do you want to know?" Meow asked faintly. Just as the air hostess smiled and was about to speak, she added, "There are some things that I can tell you. However, there are some things that I will never tell you no matter how you torture me." Don't worry, I'm not interested in your personal matters, the air hostess said directly. She naturally knew what Meow was talking about when she said that she could and could not say anything. What she could say was definitely everything that was related to Luo Fan in this world. What she could not say was definitely related to her, such as things related to the higher space-time dimension. Perhaps, Luo Fan was more concerned about the higher space-time dimension. However, to the air hostess, everything in the higher space-time dimension could not compare to Luo Fan, so she naturally did not care too much about it. That would be for the best, Meow said faintly. Did you want to deal with him just now? The air hostess asked. Of course. However, although it was my own will, and I wanted to borrow his power to return to a higher space-time dimension, it was still because of his tribulation. But at the root of it all, it was because of his tribulation. It was because he was undergoing tribulation that I appeared and came here to cause trouble for him, Meow said faintly. You are part of his tribulation. The air hostess was in disbelief. Of course. If that wasn't the case, how could I coincidentally come to this dimension among the countless space-time dimensions? Meow said with some resentment. From the air hostess' point of view, Meow was a villain, a great villain who had specially come to cause trouble for her Taoist companion. She was an existence that deserved to die 10,000 times. Meeting her was a great misfortune. However, from Meow's point of view, wasn't it also a great misfortune for her to come to this space-time dimension and meet the air hostess? All she wanted was to return to her own space-time dimension. What was wrong with that? However, such a simple and reasonable goal was ultimately used by the chaos. She was accepted by the root of tribulations in the depths of the chaos and became a part of someone's tribulations. Was this what she wanted? Hearing this, the air hostess showed an inexplicable joy as if she had heard some good news. The air hostess in the other space-time dimension also had a look of envy on her face, as if she was envious of what had happened to the air hostess. Chapter 1822. When Meow heard this, she could not help but be stunned. She did not expect the other party to be happy because of this. This mentality was simply unbelievable to her, and she wondered how the person in front of her had cultivated to this level. Forget it. I really can't understand the way you people from the lower space-time dimension think. Meow finally sighed and admitted defeat. When she heard this, the space maiden from the other space-time dimension said calmly, when you fall in love with someone, you'll know what kind of way of thinking it is. As the space maiden from another space-time dimension, her mentality was naturally quite similar to the space maiden's. To her, the space maiden being able to help Luo Fan and become a part of Luo Fan's heavenly tribulation was the most wonderful experience, and it was also the experience that she was most envious of. At this moment, she was even thinking about how to help her cultivation partner after she returned to her own space-time dimension. When Meow shook her head and said, cultivation itself is an existence of absolute self. If you have worries in your heart, there will be a heavenly moat in front of you. With such a mentality, you are taking the initiative to put the heavenly moat in front of you. I dare say that your current realm is your limit. It will be extremely difficult for you to maintain your realm in the future, and it will be a fool's dream if you want to improve. Before she could finish her sentence, it was already too late for her to explain herself. This was because she realized that at this moment, the space-time dimension around the Space Maiden had undergone a subtle change. Vaguely, the connection between her and the space-time dimension had increased a little. If an ordinary person were to see this situation, they would still be confused and would not understand what was going on. However, as an existence of a higher space-time dimension, an existence that could even materialize the space-time dimension and unleash earth-shattering power, her understanding of the space-time dimension was naturally incomparable to others, so she could naturally see what was going on at a glance. How is this possible? Her eyes were wide open, and there was disbelief in her eyes. This appearance, it was clear that the Space Maiden's intrinsic quality had improved, and her control of the space-time dimension had become more profound. The adjustment of the space-time dimension around her had become more compatible with her. In other words, it was a sign that his cultivation had risen once again, This kind of thing happened when she was certain that it was impossible for the other party to improve his cultivation state, and it was extremely difficult for him to maintain his current state. That was simply a slap in the face. How could her expression be good? Although cultivation is absolute, it's all about the self. But having worries in one's heart might not necessarily be a natural moat. Sometimes the worries in the heart can also become motivation, said the space maiden from a different space-time dimension. At this moment, when Meow's expression kept changing, he seemed to be thinking hard about the words of the empty lady from a different space-time dimension. Although you come from a higher space-time dimension and control more power than us, you are still a god. However, in terms of cultivation, you're still far behind us. The space maiden sighed again. She seemed regretful and pitiful at the same time. What she said wasn't just empty words. The man in front of him was amazing. Although he had shown great skills and even had a strong effect on the will of heaven and earth, causing damage to the will of heaven and earth. Even this part of the world was in danger of being destroyed. However, in fact, this was only the performance of her ability as a creature from a higher space-time dimension in the so-called lower space-time dimension. Just based on her own cultivation realm and her understanding of cultivation, let alone Luo Fan, she was even worse than the empty maiden by many levels. At least, she had not even comprehended the unique worldview, the foundation of becoming a saint. I don't believe it. You creatures from a lower space-time dimension. How could you understand the mysteries of our higher space-time dimension? When Meow Saint shook his head, she was unwilling to believe what the space maiden from a different space-time dimension had said. Naturally, the space maiden from a different space-time dimension understood her behavior. However, she was too lazy to say anything more. Before giving them pointers, she was still arrogantly treating them. She was not that patient to be able to say such a sentence. This could already be considered as an exception to her intention to strike a blow to the other party's morale and cause the other party's morale to fall. At this moment, the space maiden came back to her senses and said, "I've finally made progress. Unfortunately, the gap between us is still too big." When Meow could not help but ask, "What's the point of cultivating for others?" Cultivating for others? Why do you think so? The space maiden frowned. Isn't that so? Your cultivation is all about catching up to that person. You don't have your own thoughts or desires. Isn't that cultivating for others? When Meow said, the space maiden suddenly smiled sweetly and said, "So that's what you think. It seems that your cultivation state is really ordinary." Hearing such words again, when Meow's annoyance continued to pile up in his heart. It was the same for one and the same for two. He could have easily erased them with one hand, but they kept using such words to attack him. If he could tolerate it, what else could he not? She was about to explode. But at this moment, the space maiden said, "Cultivation is cultivation. Any cultivation, no matter what the motivation is, as long as it becomes the motivation for cultivation, is cultivation for oneself. I'm indeed cultivating to catch up to him. You're right about that. But so what? Is there really any difference between this and the pursuit of freedom, eternity, and immortality? Could it be that because of this goal, I will never be inferior to those who pursue their own goals in this way?" These words caused Meow to freeze on the spot. No matter what the pursuit was, in the end, wasn't it also a cultivation, a goal to improve? Wasn't it also a motivation for cultivation? In comparison, compared to the pursuit of eternity, immortality, freedom, and even the pursuit of continuous evolution. Was there really any difference between the pursuit of self-realization and the pursuit of home? This was the first time when Meow had thought about this question. It was also the first time she looked at cultivation from a perspective of a lower dimension. For a moment, countless thoughts emerged in her mind in a disorderly manner. They were the concepts of cultivation that she had accumulated over countless years. With all these thoughts, her mind was in a mess, causing her expression to constantly change. Seeing the change in her expression, the space maiden only smiled. The space maiden from a different dimension also smiled faintly. The two of them looked at Meow as if they were looking at a junior who was cultivating, as if they were looking at a latecomer who was thinking about climbing the path of cultivation. All the resentment and anger from before had disappeared without a trace at this moment. After a long time, when Meow's body trembled and all the emotions on her face disappeared completely, her entire face became unprecedentedly calm. On the other hand, her aura underwent some mysterious changes. Her body, which originally had many traces of the space-time dimension combination, had completely calmed down at this moment. Her entire body seemed no different from flesh and blood. As for the space-time dimension around her body, at this moment, the continuous fluctuations that had been caused by it had also completely calmed down. It was as if she had really become a body of flesh and blood in a lower dimension of space-time. Thank you for your pointers. If it weren't for you, I'm afraid I would never have been able to understand this cultivation principle. One Meow bowed to the Space Maiden. Hey, what about me? I've also given you pointers before, right? The Space Maiden from a different dimension said with a smile. You're just trying to give me a blow. You don't have any intention of giving me pointers at all. What's there to think? Well, Meow said faintly. She's just trying to give you a blow. Compared to me, there's no essential difference, okay? The Space Maiden from a different dimension hurriedly said. She's different. She does have the intention of giving me pointers. I'm very sure of this, well, Meow said faintly. This made the Space Maiden from a different dimension speechless. Well, Meow's senses were indeed very sharp. The Space Maiden was a little grateful that when Meow's existence allowed her to help Luo Fan pass the heavenly tribulation. Therefore, although her previous words were not completely for pointers, they still contained some intention of giving her pointers. Now, do you still want to return to your higher dimension of space-time? The Space Maiden asked. Of course. That's my hometown, my home. My family, my friends. My sect is there. How can I not want to go back? When Meow's expression had already recovered, and she sighed. Now that your original plan can't succeed, what other way do you have to go back? I don't know. When Meow's expression became a little sad, her only hope was to use the power of Luo Fan's heavenly tribulation to transcend this dimension of space-time and step into a higher dimension of space-time to return her home. But now, the method that she had prepared was heavily obstructed and she could no longer succeed. Her only hope had been completely cut off. Under such circumstances, she was at a loss as to what method she should use to transcend this dimension of space-time and return to her home. If you can't think of a way, perhaps you can wait for him to come back from the heavenly tribulation and help you take a look, the Space Maiden said confidently. The him she was talking about was naturally Luo Fan. From her words, it could be seen how much confidence she had in Luo Fan. The confidence that as long as he took action, everything could be solved and no problem would be a problem was enough to make anyone raise their eyebrows. When Meow smiled bitterly and said, What other choice do I have? That's right. You have no other choice. The Space Maiden nodded and said, Either you wait for him or you wait for death. When Meow smiled bitterly. Actually, I have a question. At this moment, the Space Maiden from the different dimension of space-time said, What question? When Meow frowned. What kind of existence is a true divine? The Space Maiden from the different dimension of space-time asked. True divine. Well, Meow's expression was a little complicated. She naturally knew what the Space Maiden from the different dimension of space-time was asking about. She was not asking about the power of a true divine or the means of a true divine existence, as understood by people from the lower dimension of space-time. Instead, she was asking about the relationship between the higher dimension of space-time and a true divine. After all, in the higher dimension of space-time, even an existence like her, who is far inferior to the Space Maiden in terms of cultivation knowledge, could fight against the will of heaven and earth in the lower dimension of space-time. In that case, was a true divine omnipotent in the higher dimension of space-time? Or was he really supreme, powerful, and noble? Regarding this question, the Space Maiden was also quite curious. At this moment, she looked at Saint Meow expectantly. Meow paused for a long time. Then, she sighed and said, A true divine is a true divine no matter where he is. Even in our dimension of space-time, he is a supreme and invincible existence. Her words caused the expressions of the two space maidens to change. An indescribable shadow instantly shrouded their heads. A true divine actually surpassed a higher dimension of space-time. What did this mean? This meant that there was a huge difference between a true divine and a cultivator like them, who were powerless in the face of an expert from a higher dimension of space-time and a true divine. It was far beyond their imagination. At this moment, even their confidence in cultivation was slightly shaken. Seeing their reaction, Miao suddenly smiled and said, "However, you don't have to think too much. True divine is indeed an invincible existence in our dimension of space-time, but it doesn't mean that they have experienced our dimension of space-time. In fact, the reason why they can do this is that their dimension of space-time has already become independent and has transcended all the space-time dimensions of the outside world. That is to say, for them, a higher dimension of space-time and a lower dimension of space-time are actually the same." Parallel? The eyes of the space maidens lit up. "I think so." Miao sighed. For Miao, who believed that he was a high-level being who could overlook all lower dimensions of time and space, it was obviously not a pleasant fact for him to admit that he was on the same level as the beings he looked down upon in the eyes of certain beings. However, this is already very unbelievable. The space maidens from the different dimension of space-time sighed. Her words caused the joy on the space maiden's face to gradually fade. Finally, she also sighed. After a while, Miao asked the space maidens, "What do you plan to do with me next?" Although it seemed that she was asking for punishment by asking this question, it seemed rather irrational. But in fact, for existences at their level, there was not much meaning in delaying and speaking empty words. Even if she continued to delay, she would eventually not be able to avoid it. What was the difference between asking and waiting for the other party to deal with her? The space maidens came back to her senses and pointed at the space maidens from the different dimension of space-time. She said, "Of course I'm the same as her." This made the space maidens frown. She said, "No matter what, we've been through life and death together. Why are you still looking at me like that?" Upon hearing this, Miao heaved a sigh of relief. Perhaps to the space maidens from the different dimension of space-time, being imprisoned by the space maidens and unable to leave was an unacceptable experience. However, to Miao, being able to receive such treatment after becoming enemies was already a pleasant surprise. Then what are we waiting for? Let's go. Although I've seen a lot before, I've been sleeping most of the time to recover my energy. I've never seen this world with my own eyes. Miao smiled. The various conversations between the three of them in the center were not detected by the many supreme emperors outside. Therefore, at this moment, they were talking as if there was no one else around, and no cultivators came to disturb them. In fact, during this process, many supreme emperors used various methods to investigate them countless times, but they did not discover their existence. This was to be expected. After all, among the supreme emperors, even the level 3 supreme emperors did not cultivate in the space-time dimension. As for the three of them, there was no need to mention Miao. He was an existence that had descended from a higher space-time dimension, and his use of the space-time dimension had already reached an unbelievable level. If he did not want to be detected, how could the cultivators that did not cultivate in the space-time dimension detect him? As for the two space maidens, they had already somewhat grasped their own space-time dimension. With the help of the space-time dimension's concealment, how could their aura be leaked? Naturally, they would not be detected. At this moment, although the surrounding supreme emperors clearly knew that there was definitely something strange going on, they could only gradually disperse and leave their doubts in their hearts. They did not dare to continue being entangled here. The three space maidens naturally did not have the mood to pay attention to them. Although the two space maidens did not view everything in the space-time dimension as low-level existences like Miao and could not be bothered to pay any attention to them, they did not view all living beings as equals either. To them, apart from Luo Fan, everything else in this world did not have much to do with them. As long as they did not provoke them, they would not pay too much attention to them. They would not pay much attention to them if they were injured, if they died, if they obtained benefits, or if their benefits were lost at this moment. The Space Maidens only smiled faintly and led with Meow and the Space Maidens from another space-time dimension away from the area where they had narrowly escaped death. They continued their journey in this world. This world is not bad. I have traveled through so many low-level space-time dimensions before, but this world is the highest level and has the greatest suppression on me. If I had been in another space-time dimension, I would not have ended up like this. Yes, yes, yes. Believe me, I actually only used 30% of my strength previously. I believe you, I believe you. Chapter 1823. While Sky Maiden's group and Saint Meow were traversing the world, there was a ball of flames that was originally frozen in the misty space that was the intersection of many space-time dimensions, and it was already blazing. Luo Fan, who had been scattered into countless pieces, had condensed into a small flame in the middle of the flame. He was like the heart of the huge flame that was burning fiercely in the middle of the flame. However, this was only the appearance. It was just a manifestation of his body, his life source, and all his physical things. In fact, his spirit, his will, and all of his senses had sunk into an extremely mysterious and strange world at this moment. The reason why this world was strange was because of the nature of its existence. It seemed to be formed from the power of the great calamity, but it also seemed like a world that already existed. In this world, Luo Fan had completely turned into an ordinary low-level life form that could only move in the mud. This process had actually been going on for billions of years. Before this, he had always been in a daze. He did not have the slightest bit of spiritual sense or intelligence, and he did not have any memories of his past life. He could only be like an ordinary low-level life form, constantly reincarnating in this world and reincarnating. Moreover, he had even been divided into countless parts and turned into billions of life forms that reincarnated, struggled, and even killed each other in this world. Not long ago, his spirit had been stimulated by some kind of indescribable thing. Strands of memories were born from nothingness and attached themselves to his body again. He had recovered. That was why he was able to retrieve all his bodies during this reincarnation and become a whole again. That was also why. That was why he had released his senses from the outside world and attached them to his body again. That was why he could use his body to learn about everything that had happened in the world he had created after he began to undergo the heavenly tribulation. That was also why the changes that Sky Maiden had sensed earlier happened. That was why his aura permeated the entire world at this moment and completely enveloped the entire world. Higher space-time dimensions. He had also learned about Meow's origin at that time. However, he still did not understand the higher space-time dimensions at all. The reason why he was able to understand the impact of Meow's death was because of his ability. It was only because his realm was quite high that he could see danger and opportunity at a glance. The mysteries of such a high space-time dimension were obviously a great temptation to Luo Fan. It had an absolute attraction. However, this was not the time for him to focus on this. At this moment, he was still struggling in this great tribulation, still sinking in this wonderful and strange world. The first thing he had to do was, of course, to escape from this great calamity. How could he have the energy to care about anything else? That was why he didn't care about anything else. After discovering that Sky Maiden and the world outside were not in danger, he placed all his attention on this low-level creature's body. What kind of world is this? Is it formed by the power of the Great Tribulation, or does it already exist? He began to sense the power of the outside world. At this moment, he had an intuition that if he died again, what awaited him would not be reincarnation, but a complete death. Therefore, the first thing he had to do was to make himself stronger so that he could get rid of his current low-level creature's body. As a low-level creature, it shouldn't even have intelligence. If it wanted to sense the outside world, it wouldn't be able to do so. It was almost impossible for him to sense the outside world. Fortunately, Luo Fan had already retrieved his memory, which itself possessed unimaginable power. This allowed him to break through the limitations of his race and regain his intelligence. Only then could he sense the power of the outside world. When he sensed the power of the outside world, he could not help but feel an indescribable shock. The power of the outside world was hundreds of millions of times more profound than he had imagined. In fact, the power that was hundreds of millions of times more profound than he had imagined was only because of the limitations of his own understanding. He could only scratch the surface of the mysterious power. How could there be such a world? Luo Fan was secretly shocked. After the shock, he could not help but feel an indescribable joy. Cultivating in such a world, any gain would be a great gain. At this moment, he began to work hard to sense the mystery of the power and began to analyze it through his own worldview. Through this analysis, he looked for a way to absorb the power into his body and transform his body. This was not a simple thing. It could even be said to be an extravagant hope that was as difficult as ascending to heaven. Even with Luo Fan's boundless memories, even if his comprehension of power had reached the pinnacle, he was still extremely shallow and ignorant when it came to these powers. He had sensed it for millions of years, but he could only slightly mobilize a trace of the power of the outside world. As for wanting to absorb it into one's body and borrow its power to transform one's own body, that was even more impossible on this day. After failing to absorb the power again, Luo Fan finally could not help but lament, "What kind of power is this? Even the power of a true sage shouldn't reach this level." After this lament, he was suddenly stunned. That was because he suddenly realized that more than 6 million years had passed, and his current body was not the body that had infinite lifespan or could even be considered eternal. Instead, it was the body of a low-level creature that could not even mobilize any power. He had grasped such a body countless times in the past, but every time it was either a matter of life and death or only a few days of lifespan. How could it be possible to live for millions of years without dying or disappearing? Why am I not dead yet? He was extremely puzzled. At the same time, he had an epiphany. If he could find the answer to this question, he would be able to do so. If he could find the answer to this question, he might be able to get what he wanted. Compared to the countless parts of him in the past, the current him, apart from the difference in completeness, the biggest difference was he could sense the power of the outside world, which he could not do in the past at all. Therefore, the mystery that allowed him to live for millions of years was naturally his ability to sense the power of the outside world. But how is this possible? I didn't absorb these powers at all. These powers are like ducks listening to thunder, ignoring all my wishes and thoughts. They don't move at all. Why can they increase my lifespan so much? This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind. With this thought in mind, he began to change the target of his analysis and began to analyze this aspect of these powers. Just like this, nearly 100,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, the body of Luo Fan, that low-level creature, suddenly shook before exploding with a loud bang. It turned into a wriggling mist that gradually began to shrink. Not long after, it had turned into a thumb-sized humanoid creature. After transforming into his current body, he laughed out loud. "I've finally returned to human form. Ha ha!" At this moment, the power around him began to surge continuously like the waves of the sea. They surged around his body and formed a sound that sounded like music. Along with this sound, Luo Fan's body gradually began to expand like a balloon. The rate of expansion wasn't very fast. It took him 1,000 years to grow from thumb size to the size of a normal person's body, or rather, the appearance of his true body. At this stage, only then did he slowly open his eyes and look in all directions. Until this moment, only now did he truly see the world clearly. This was an incomparably wild and primitive world. In this world, there were forests and ancient trees everywhere, poisonous insects and ferocious beasts everywhere, and there were all kinds of poisonous fog and miasma everywhere. At a glance, there was not a single trace of man-made things. Luo Fan was actually at the top of a tree. There used to be a small tree pit here. There was a thin layer of silt in the pit. Countless creatures that were invisible to the naked eye were wriggling and struggling inside. Previously, he was one of those countless creatures. In fact, It was precisely because he had always been one of those creatures that he could survive for such a long time without encountering any attacks from poisonous insects or ferocious beasts. In fact, he had grown from the size of a thumb to the size of a normal person in the past 1,000 years because he had been high up in the sky. If he had been on the ground instead of here, just standing still for 1,000 years would have been enough for those ferocious beasts to eat him. Looking at this wild and primitive world, Luo Fan wore a faint smile on his face. At this moment, there was still not a single trace of power in his body. However, his own strength was already comparable to his original body. In other words, he was an incredible existence that had surpassed the level of a level 3 Supreme Emperor. The reason for this was very simple. It was because he had already understood a little bit of the power of this world. In fact, the power of this world might be of a higher level and more mysterious than the power of a true sage. At Luo Fan's level, if he were to absorb even a trace or a wisp of this energy into his body, it would definitely cause his body to explode and turn into countless fragments. It was even possible that even the fragments wouldn't be able to survive. Because of this, his life instincts prevented him from absorbing this power into his body for such a long time. That was why he was unable to use this power for such a long time. However, after discovering that as a low-level creature, he had actually lived for millions of years without absorbing this power, he began to research in this area, and finally, after nearly 100,000 years, he found a trace of mystery. The power of this world did not need to be absorbed like other powers in order to have an effect. The power of this world was so profound that it could accomplish countless miraculous things that other powers couldn't. However, as long as he could sense it, he would be able to intercept its power. In other words, as long as he could sense this power, in fact, as long as he could sense this power, he would be able to explode with earth-shattering power. It might even reach or even surpass his body. For an existence at Luo Fan's level, as long as he knew how the power worked, it was as easy as eating a meal for him to create a corresponding cultivation method to bring out this effect to the limit. That was why this change happened. But how do I go back to my body? Do I have to destroy this world? Looking at the vast world, Luo Fan suddenly felt a headache. He had only just obtained a trace of the mystery of this world's power. It was simply a fool's dream to want to destroy this world. If he really needed to use this method to break out of this world and return to his body, he could simply give up. It can't be like this. After making this judgment, his body swayed and he flew into the sky. He quickly flew in the direction where he felt more comfortable. There was no power in his body, and he could not even use the power around him. However, he could still use the power of this power. This was quite a novel method for him. At the same time, he was not used to it. After flying for a few days, they finally arrived. Only then did he really get used to this method of flying, and he could really bring out the speed of this method of flying to the limit. Therefore, in these few days, he had only flown for a few million miles, but after a few days, he was already tens of millions of miles away in a flash. There were no signs of human habitation in this world. Luo Fan finally completely confirmed this after flying for a few months. However, the absence of human habitation did not mean that there were no intelligent creatures. In fact, the number of intelligent creatures was much more than he had imagined. In this entire world, almost every region, every position, there were intelligent creatures. It was just that none of these intelligent creatures were in human form. They all existed in the form of insects, fish, birds, and beasts. Moreover, none of them were the insects, fish, birds, and beasts that Luo Fan was familiar with. Instead, they were all kinds of insects, fish, birds, and beasts that even he found strange and unbelievable. Apart from communicating with those intelligent creatures a few times in the beginning, Luo Fan completely gave up on the idea of getting the information he wanted from them. There was no other reason. It was because he could not understand their way of thinking at all. This way of thinking that he could not understand was not an extension, but a literal meaning. Although he could clearly feel that they were intelligent when he communicated with them, they were not simple and stupid like ordinary beasts. However, when he communicated with them, it was as if he was communicating with the will of heaven and earth. He could not understand them at all. Similarly, Luo Fan could not understand them, and they, too, could not understand Luo Fan. Even if they were all extremely intelligent and could even have a direct spiritual connection with each other, it was still the same. After this happened a few times, Luo Fan could only give up on the idea of continuing to communicate with them to get information about this world. Since he could not get information from other intelligent creatures, he could only walk in this world by himself and find a way to leave this world. Just like that, another millions of years passed. During these few million years, Luo Fan had been walking and flying in this world. He had been constantly searching, analyzing the various secrets of this world, and constantly sensing the power of this world. Although it had been such a long time, and his speed was unimaginably fast, it was impossible for him to escape. However, after spending millions of years, what he had seen in this world was only a tiny, insignificant bit compared to the world as a whole. If this world was compared to Earth, then the area that he had walked in for millions of years was only the size of a grain of sand. When he truly understood the size of this world, he could not help but feel an inexplicable sense of despair. This still won't work. On this day, Luo Fan stopped on a mountain and sighed inwardly. Although it had been a million years, he still looked no different from before. There was still no power in his body, and his face did not show any signs of aging. It was as if time had completely stopped for him. Maybe I should stop and cultivate for a while. After sighing, he had this thought. Cultivation was not only about absorbing power. Understanding power, studying power, mobilizing power, and even training the mind and so on were all cultivation. In the past few million years, although Luo Fan did not give up on cultivation at any time, he was distracted after all, and the efficiency was ultimately not as high as cultivating in a cave abode. With this thought in mind, coupled with the recognition of the vastness of this world, Luo Fan no longer hesitated. He immediately used the power of the surrounding power to transform this mountain. Not only was this world extremely mysterious, but even the matter and space-time contained all kinds of incredible mysteries. There is no need to mention how tough and sturdy it was. If Luo Fan's original body came here, with his own power, wanting to transform this mountain would be even more troublesome than transforming the entire perfect world. Chapter 1824. The power of this world was of a mysterious and extremely high level, but happened to be the opposite of the matter of this world. To this power, the matter of this world was just ordinary matter. If it wanted to destroy, change, and rebuild, it would be extremely simple. Therefore, under Luo Fan's control, the mountain gradually changed. In a short while, it had been transformed into a huge fortress that had never been seen in this world before. This fortress looked extremely simple and majestic. Every part of its walls and every bump contained the beauty of architecture and even contained all kinds of indescribable mysteries. If there was an existence with the same way of thinking as Luo Fan who saw this, they would certainly be greatly amazed. They would be amazed at the ingenious design of this fortress and the extreme beauty of the architectural art. However, it was obvious that although there were endless intelligent creatures in this world, none of them had the same way of thinking as him. In the eyes of all intelligent beings, Luo Fan's behavior was the same as how Luo Fan viewed their various behaviors. They could not understand it all. As for this fortress that had the extreme beauty of architecture in Luo Fan's eyes, in their eyes, it was probably like the aesthetics of a centipede. After admiring this transformation, Luo Fan could only sigh and land on the highest point of the fortress. This fortress did not just look beautiful. In fact, every building and structure within it contained countless mysteries. And these mysteries were in line with the power of this world. Through these mysteries, he could collect and gather the might of the power in this world that he could not absorb in a mysterious way. And then he could do things that he could not do on his own. In fact, it was similar to the legendary Wizard Tower. This was also the fundamental reason why Luo Fan wanted to build this fortress to live in. Although this world was mysterious, he wanted to transcend and break through this world. And in order to achieve this goal, he obviously had to use various methods to study this world and understand it. He randomly found a place to live. He closed his eyes and meditated. Of course, this would not be a problem in other places where he could completely control and absorb power. However, in this world, when faced with a power that he could not absorb or control, if he continued like this, the efficiency would obviously be too low. Only by constructing something similar to a mage tower like what he was doing now, using the matter of this world to mobilize the power of this world and transform the power of this world, would he be able to better study them, understand this world, and find the true secrets of this world. For Luo Fan, this was a new experience that he had never experienced before. Ever since he had transmigrated to the primordial world and stepped onto the path of cultivation, power was of utmost importance to him. It was equivalent to an existence that could be absorbed at will. After he became a Khanate Grand Luo, he could even create them at will. Under such circumstances, there was no need for him to indirectly understand power. Research power? However, it had to be said that this new experience allowed him to understand power from a different perspective, allowing him to observe the world from a different perspective. When he really immersed himself in it, he suddenly realized that he couldn't absorb or control power. In fact, he had countless ways to understand the mysteries of this world. It seems that after such a long period of time, what a waste. As he sighed, Luo Fan began to study the power of this world through the fortress. Through a deeper understanding of power, he would continuously modify the fortress and use the new fortress to delve deeper or study the power of this world from a new perspective, forming a virtuous cycle. Time slowly passed as he repeated the cycle. Unknowingly, 100,000 years had passed. After 100,000 years of modification, the fortress was no longer limited to a single mountain. Instead, it spread over thousands of mountains and spanned hundreds of thousands of kilometers. The fortress, which was originally as tall as a mountain, was now built to be tens of thousands of kilometers tall, reaching into the clouds and vaguely reaching the stars. Such a huge and majestic fortress was constantly absorbing the incomparably mysterious power of this world. This power was constantly shifting and changing through the countless structures and buildings in the fortress, gradually condensing its power and gathering at the center of the fortress, which was also the highest position or room. Here, Luo Fan was sitting cross-legged in front of a pond. The pond was right in the middle of the room. It wasn't too big, only a few hundred meters in radius. The water in the pond was clear, transparent, and calm without any ripples. I can't absorb the power of this world because my body can't withstand it. However, this doesn't mean that I can't absorb the power of this world. This thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and his expression became firm. At this moment, what was in the pond wasn't water, nor was it power. Instead, it was the power of the power that was originally invisible and material. Of course, the power within it wasn't all the power that the mysterious power possessed. Instead, it was the power that Luo Fan separated from it, a power that he could understand. It was also a power that was compatible with his worldview. The strongest effect of this power was to transform and enhance one's body. It was carried out in a way that was suitable for the worldview and the structure of the worldview. The power had turned into this substance because of the effect of the fortress itself. Although the pond didn't look like it had a lot of water, and there wasn't even a lake, that was only on the surface. In fact, the amount of power here would probably be as huge as a boundless ocean if it were to be unleashed. The reason it looked so small here was because the fortress itself contained the effect of compressing space. This effect of compressing space was also the result of his research on the power of this world over the past few days. It was a change that occurred after he integrated the power of this power into the fortress. After taking a deep breath, Luo Fan fused his mind with the core of the fortress. He started to control the fortress and change some of its internal structures, as if he was activating an incomparably huge machine. The entire fortress started to tremble slightly, and countless structural changes kept appearing. It kept enlarging and advancing, and finally, the water in the pond in front of him started to swirl. A vortex gradually appeared on the surface of the pond, and as the changes in the entire fortress became more and more intense, it became more and more obvious, and the speed of its rotation became faster and faster. Finally, at a certain moment, a column of water rushed straight up from the center of the vortex, drew an extremely mysterious trajectory in the air, and poured straight into the top of Luo Fan's head. At this moment, an unimaginable pain suddenly engulfed him. Although it was only the power of power and not the power itself, he had chosen this power layer by layer, and it was the power that was most suitable for his body and his worldview. However, this power, in the end, it was still too powerful. Although his body had been modified, it was still too weak. He had to endure this power. However, it was still too forceful. At this moment, the spiritual consciousness of the fortress sensed this change and naturally began to adjust, causing the power that was pouring into his body to shrink and decrease continuously. Moreover, the power also started to become gentler. This finally prevented his body from completely collapsing and exploding under the infusion of this power. The indescribable pain weakened a lot because of this, but it still existed. Sensing this change, Luo Fan let out a long breath. All these years of preparation had not been in vain after all. Fortunately, he had put in a lot of effort to build this fortress, and he hadn't rashly absorbed this power. Otherwise, his body would have crumbled and perished at the first moment. Even with the vastness of the fortress, it was still rather strenuous to limit this power. At this moment, the entire fortress kept shaking, and countless structures started to shake slightly, as if it could not bear the heavy burden. The power of the entire world gradually formed a stronger and stronger pressure on the fortress. This fortress was simply suffering from both internal and external problems. However, all of this was secondary to Luo Fan. At this moment, he gradually felt an indescribable comfort coming from his body. His body started to improve continuously under the effect of the power. That power began to gradually construct an illusory organ in his body that he had researched over the years. It could contain this power, and it began to gradually absorb this power into that organ. Following this change, wisps of black fog started to float out of his body, and his aura started to grow continuously. The aura of his entire body was becoming more and more exuberant. This change was simply like being reborn. It went without saying that the power of a boundless ocean would take a very long time to be injected into a person's body in a line that was the size of a strand of hair. As for how long it would take, Luo Fan had already expected it. Hence, at this moment, he calmed his mind and carefully sensed the power gathering in his body, as well as the changes that occurred in his body. However, as more and more power accumulated in his body, he unknowingly gained a better understanding of the nature of the power. He also gained a better understanding of the structure of the organs that contained power in his body. Therefore, as he continued to accumulate power, he also constantly adjusted and modified this organ. Just like that, 1,000,000 years passed in the blink of an eye. On this day, Luo Fan finally injected the last wisp of power into his body, finally stabilizing the organ that could accommodate the power. At this moment, Luo Fan's body radiated boundless brilliance. The entire fortress started to shake at this moment. The moment Luo Fan opened his eyes, the entire fortress, from top to bottom, from inside to outside, had completely collapsed in the blink of an eye. It turned into the finest powder and started to gradually dissipate. In the end, it was blown away by a gentle breeze. In the blink of an eye, it had already disappeared without a trace, turning the originally large area into a huge crater. As for Luo Fan, at this moment, he didn't rely on anything. He didn't even use the power of sensing the power of the outside world like before. He just floated in the air. At this moment, he seemed to be hundreds of millions of times stronger than before. Just by floating there, his presence had already suppressed the entire land. Even the power in the surroundings naturally changed its operating pattern and started to wrap around his body. They revolved around him and constantly made all sorts of mysterious changes. My body is hundreds of millions of times stronger than before. Even compared to my main body, it's still hundreds of times stronger. At this moment, Luo Fan had an epiphany. He stood there and looked up. The entire world in his eyes had already undergone earth-shattering changes. The nomological laws that couldn't be seen at all before were now vivid in his eyes. The great path of this world that he couldn't sense before was now clearly visible. In fact, the structure of this world, it was completely different from everything he knew in the past. In this place, the nomological laws didn't form a nomological layer. The great path wasn't deep in the unseen world either. In this place, everything was integrated into the power. In other words, the power contained all the nomological laws of this world. In the power, it also contained the great path of this world. No wonder I can't absorb it. I can't mobilize the power of this world. Not to mention the profoundness that surpasses the true sage level. Just the structure alone is enough to make people feel helpless. This is already enough to make people feel helpless. Such a thought flashed in Luo Fan's mind at this time. His current perspective was due to the improvement of his body. Because of the changes that occurred after his body was transformed by the infinite power. It could be said that this was already the most suitable, extraordinary perspective for this world. Looking at the past from this perspective, it was already very in line with the true mystery of this world and the true truth. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. The mountain-like power in his body moved slightly, and in a flash he had already traversed through time and space. He appeared in the instant when this world had just been formed. Who knew how many billions of years ago? In other words, it was the earliest time of this world according to his understanding. Those are my fragments. As he looked up, the entire world instantly entered his eyes. On the boundless land, there were endless light spots. Each of these light spots had his aura. Each of them was a part of him. Obviously, this was the scene of him being split into countless parts and thrown into this world. Back then, I saw this world still in flames. Looking at this scene, Luo Fan couldn't help but smile faintly. With another thought, he traversed through time and space again and appeared billions of years later. He appeared on top of a huge tree. There was a light spot here that was more intense than any other light spot. It was in a pit at the top of the tree. This was the time when he had just regained his senses and when his body had just become one. It turns out that it was because I was here that everything went so smoothly. Looking at the dot of light, Luo Fan suddenly had a realization. As he comprehended this, he casually pointed with his finger, and the surrounding power naturally released some kind of indescribable power that abruptly shielded the pit so that no living being could discover it. After doing this, he did not stop. His figure moved again, and he activated the power in his body again, traversing through time and space again. However, this time, he did not go to the past, but to the infinitely distant future. He wanted to see the end of this world. He had an inexplicable intuition in his heart. As long as he could see the end of this world, he would be able to transcend this world and return to his body to survive this tribulation. The future was almost endless. Just now, when he traversed through time and space to the past billions of years ago, it had only taken him a moment. This time, he was heading to the extremely distant future. While he felt the mountain-like power in his body continuously being consumed, he also felt that time was getting longer and longer. Originally, it was just a moment, and he could not see what would happen in his surroundings during the process of traversing through time and space. However, now that time was continuously increasing, the state he was in during the process of traversing was continuously lengthening. This allowed him to gradually see his surroundings clearly and see what the process of traversing was. At this moment, countless lights and shadows were pulled together, forming a world of ever-changing colors. Countless colors were mixed together in a mysterious way, making him feel like he could see countless things. However, he could not see anything clearly and could not understand anything. 1 day, 2 days, 10 days, 1 month, 2 months, 1 year, 2 years, 10 years, 20 years, 100 years, as he constantly traversed through time and space. Luo Fan sensed that time gradually passed. Before he knew it, 10 million years had passed. He could traverse billions of years in an instant. How much time would it take to traverse 10 million years? Even if Luo Fan thought about it for a moment, he could not help but feel an indescribable shock in his heart. However, there was still an end to this kind of traversing. Finally, at a certain moment, the light and shadow in front of him changed, and an eternally unmoving world appeared in front of him. Chapter 1825. This world was the one he had been looking at previously. However, compared to the previous world, there was a world of difference between the appearance of this world and that of the previous one. The whole world had not decayed, nor was it broken. However, the terrain and scenery had changed completely. At a glance, there was nothing familiar about it. Here, Luo Fan was the only living existence in this world that could move. Apart from him, everything else was at a standstill. Power was at a standstill, the earth was at a standstill, the sky was at a standstill, space was at a standstill, and even time was at a standstill. Everything was like a three-dimensional picture. Is this the end of the world? Looking at this scene, Luo Fan had such a feeling in his heart. Here, the power of this world that he had absorbed in his body underwent a subtle change. In a trance, it seemed like it was going to turn from an illusory level into something substantial. The changes were extremely mysterious and profound. Vaguely, he felt as if he had been affected by this completely still world. Just as Luo Fan was about to move, his expression suddenly changed, because he suddenly realized that he could no longer move. His body, his everything, and the power of the power in his body had been completely frozen. Not even the slightest change could be made. How could this be? This thought flashed across his mind. However, Luo Fan was Luo Fan after all. His thoughts were clear, and his knowledge was extensive. He instantly understood what was going on, because, be it the mechanism, the rules, or the power that froze this entire world, all of them far exceeded the limits of what he could endure. Any existence that wanted to move in a certain world or a certain space would definitely affect something in its surroundings, or air, or power, rules, or even space-time. Even if it was an existence at Luo Fan's level, it would still be the same. There would not be an exception just because his level was higher. However, in this world, at least at this time, the mechanism that had frozen the whole world, it had exceeded his endurance limit. In this way, he could not stir anything around him at all, and he could not make anything around him move. This very obviously turned into a kind of solidifying power that locked onto his body, locked onto all of his movements, and locked onto all of his existence. That was why he couldn't move. That was why he could only think at this moment. In fact, even his thought process. At this moment, it seemed to be gradually stagnating and slowing down. It seemed that the operation of his thoughts would also cause some kind of change, and that change was also stagnant, making it impossible for him to move it. Conversely, it produced a counterforce that also affected his thoughts. When he thought about this, even Luo Fan couldn't help but feel anxious. If this were to continue and his thoughts were completely frozen, things would be terrible. He might even be frozen in this world, unable to transcend, unable to escape. In that case, it would be equivalent to him failing the tribulation and falling into eternal silence. At this moment, sensing this terrible scene, Luo Fan tried his best to mobilize his thoughts. He began to think about how to get out of this situation. The endless power that had gathered in his body began to fluctuate violently at this moment. Waves of impact began to quickly spread throughout his body, and it began to drive his body to attack the surroundings. It was to give his body the power to move again. His body had been tempered by the power, and now it had become even more powerful than his original body. Although this kind of body still couldn't withstand the power of this world, it still couldn't resist the impact of the power of this world. However, He already had a sliver of the ability to resist. At this moment, as he willed and the power in his body surged, his body began to make creaking sounds. However, because the surroundings had completely frozen, this sound couldn't be transmitted at all, and it couldn't make sound appear in this world again. Sound itself could only be transmitted because of vibrations. Even if it was a sound that could be transmitted through various cultivation methods without the need for a medium, it could only be transmitted through the vibration of some mysterious existence. And in this world, at least at this moment, the vibrations of everything in this world had already been frozen. In this way, the vibrations couldn't be transmitted, and naturally, sound couldn't exist. However, although this sound couldn't be transmitted, it was like thunder in Luo Fan's heart, constantly shaking his mind and attacking his rationality. Waves of intense pain were transmitted to his heart at this moment. He knew that his body was being torn apart bit by bit and was being crushed bit by bit. However, no matter how much he tore and crushed, his body couldn't really move. He couldn't break through the freezing mechanism around him. Of course, compared to other places, this freezing effect also had an advantage. That was, no matter how his body was torn apart, even if it turned into powder or turned into nothingness, his body would still maintain its original appearance. It would still maintain its complete form. This freezing mechanism far surpassed the combined power of his body. At this moment, it completely replaced the combined power. Even if the combined power in his body was completely destroyed and eliminated by the impact, the solidification mechanism still replaced the combined power, allowing his body to maintain its original state. Even under such circumstances, the might was still pounding against his body, still pounding against the parts of his body that had been reduced to dust. This power couldn't find a way out, and it couldn't be released. Under the influence of Luo Fan's will, it kept attacking and searching. This power was getting stronger and stronger, and at the same time, it began to gradually spread in three directions. That was the many fragments of his body. Many fragments. In a trance, the power that had been gathered by Luo Fan for a long time and had even turned into a boundless ocean started to gradually fuse with his body. As the power fused with his body, many parts of his body and the fragments started to become stronger and stronger. They also became more and more compatible with the power of this world. In Luo Fan's mind, time began to pass slowly. Unknowingly, hundreds of millions of years had passed. One day, the infinite quantitative change finally triggered a qualitative change. An inexplicable change occurred in his body. He could feel his body again. If not for the solidification mechanism of the outside world, his body, which had already turned into countless fine powder, would have completely collapsed and turned into nothingness, had actually reformed at this moment. This combination formed a strange field that made his thinking speed up rapidly, gradually returning to its original level. Even more so, because of the suppression from before, it was like a spring, but it had begun to cross over to a higher peak, transforming toward a higher level. For a moment, countless thoughts appeared in his mind. My body has already become so strong that no power can harm it. In the end, these countless thoughts converged into one, which was the one before his eyes. At this moment, the energy that was originally gathered inside his body was slowly fading away. The ocean-like power had been reduced by nearly half. The consumed energy was still in his body, but it had completely fused with his body, becoming a part of his body. It no longer existed in the form of power. And in this process, his body had completely transformed into a structure that he was extremely familiar with, but also extremely unfamiliar with. This structure was unfamiliar because he had never seen such a structure before. This was the first time this structure had appeared in the universe, and the first time it had appeared in his body. The reason why it felt familiar was because this structure made him feel as if he was looking at his own worldview at first glance. This is the body gradually turning into the materialization of the worldview. Countless judgments appeared and disappeared, and finally, Luo Fan came to his conclusion. At this moment, although the manifestation of his body was completely different from the appearance of his life source, which had completely turned into a world, it was also the materialization of the worldview. Looking at this body was also like looking at his worldview. All the structure, operation, and changes within this body contained the mysteries of the worldview. The reason for such a change was very simple. It was because the power that he had collected back then was the power that was completely in line with his worldview. And this power constantly transformed his body, making it transform again and again. This naturally made his body finally change in a direction that was suitable for the worldview. And when this change reached the extreme, it naturally made this body become the materialization of the worldview. In fact, only this kind of power could achieve this. That was because this power was extracted from a power that even surpassed the true sage stage, and it contained all the changes and mysteries of the nomological worldview. If it was in any other world, using any other power, even the power of the true sage stage, would definitely not be able to achieve this. The reason was very simple. The power of the true sage stage itself contained a certain unique worldview. Even if that worldview was all-encompassing, and even if it was similar to the worldview of laws, it could not be completely equivalent. Only this kind of power that surpassed the true sage stage could achieve this. After understanding the changes in his body, Luo Fan suddenly felt an indescribable sense of awkwardness. It was as if there were extremely stubborn shackles that were sealing his body, preventing him from truly completing this physical transformation. I must break this solidified mechanism to complete this change. In an instant, he came to a realization. The body that was materialized by the worldview of laws, no matter how similar its appearance was to the innate Taoism body of the Earth universe, was not the innate Taoism body of the Earth universe. There must be some kind of difference between it and the innate Taoism body. This difference, no matter how small, was extremely important to the worldview of laws. As long as this difference could not be completed, then this kind of materialization was not perfect. It wasn't perfect, it wasn't even complete. At this time, the solidified mechanism that existed in this world completely blocked all changes in his body's appearance. In order to make any changes in his body, any changes in the details, he would need to break through that solidified mechanism in order to do so. Under such circumstances, how could he complete this transformation and complete this change? In this way, this naturally led to the current result. To break this solidified mechanism, such a thought flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and there was an extremely determined look in his eyes. At this moment, he began to exert the incomparably powerful power that still existed in his body. This power had been reduced by half compared to before. Even the power that was originally intact could not break through that solidified mechanism. Although his body was many times stronger now, it was obviously impossible for him to break through this mechanism with only half of his power left. Therefore, what he needed to do now was to increase this power. Not only did he need to completely restore this power to its original completeness, but he also needed to make this power reach the peak that he could condense. Only then would there be a possibility of success. Fortunately, although this was an impossible task for Luo Fan in the past, it was achievable for him now. When a cultivator stepped into the innate grand Luo realm, the power within their body could be born out of thin air and be self-sufficient. Luo Fan's current level was more than 1 trillion times higher than the innate grand Luo. How could he not do it? This kind of power was incompatible with his body in the past, and he had relied on the transformation of his body. It could only be contained by forming some sort of illusory organ. However, at this moment, after his body had transformed over 100 million years ago, this power had already completely fused with his body. That illusory organ, it had long since faded away because it was incompatible with a worldview of laws. Under such circumstances, this kind of power had already become a rather special power to him. Since it was power, it was only natural for him to create it out of thin air. At that moment, with a thought in Luo Fan's heart, this ocean-like power began to gradually circulate within his body, gradually forming a tract that was so complicated that even a false sage would not be able to withstand the information within and have their minds collapse. The cycle repeated endlessly. With each cycle, this power would increase a little out of thin air. Although this speed was extremely slow and was far inferior to the speed at which a mortal could accumulate vital chi through chi cultivation, it was still an increase after all, and it represented his last hope. This is already the limit. This isn't power after all. It's still an incomparably powerful power. He sighed in his heart, and his mind gradually immersed in this power cycle. It was not that he was satisfied with this speed of increase in power, but because this was already the limit that he could reach. With his current cultivation base and the perfection of his worldview, he could only create a cultivation method that could reach this level of efficiency and could only increase the power at this speed. In this world, even time had frozen. Therefore, no matter how long he felt that he had stayed here, in reality, the time was only the moment when he stepped into this world. In other words, he had enough time to squander. No matter how slow the increase in power was, as long as it could be increased, he would have enough time to make it increase to the limit. He would make it increase to a level that his body could no longer bear, or even to a level that this world could no longer bear. Time passed quickly. 100 million years passed. 1 billion years passed. 10 billion years passed. 100 billion years passed. 1 trillion years passed. As time passed, the passage of time had unknowingly turned into a concept in his heart that could not be shaken. In other words, under the passage of time that even surpassed the description of numbers, Luo Fan had unknowingly allowed his perception to surpass time. In a trance, billions of years gradually became the same as an instant. And in an instant, unknowingly, he was already able to sense it for billions of years. This indescribable and wonderful feeling could be said to be a shocking transformation for him. It seemed to have gradually allowed him to have a higher perspective and a higher perception. At a certain moment, Luo Fan's heart jolted as such a thought flashed through his mind. Could this be the true saint's perception of time? At this moment, this thought seemed to have opened the door to a whole new world, making him feel that the world in front of him had suddenly become unprecedentedly vast. Is it true? An indescribable doubt arose in his heart. The true saint realm was an unimaginable realm for any cultivator. For example, when Luo Fan had just stepped into the immortal realm in the untainted world and became an itinerant immortal, he had already comprehended a primordial chaos Tao fruit, which was also a true saint realm cultivation method, through Pangu's primordial spirit. At that time, he thought he had a good understanding of true saints, and he even vaguely felt that as long as he stepped into the connate zenith heaven, he would only be one step away from true saints. However, after that, almost every time he advanced a realm, he found that true saints were a step further away from him. Every time he improved a little, he would realize how shallow his understanding of the true divine was, and how many mistakes he had made previously. Chapter 1826. Even now, in Luo Fan's eyes, the existence of a true sage was still extremely mysterious. Even though he already knew that the key to becoming a true sage was to master an absolutely complete and perfect worldview that was completely in line with his own cognition. However, he couldn't be sure what this worldview would look like in the hands of a true sage, what magical powers it would have, and what power it would have. Even though he knew that a true sage must have an absolutely complete space-time dimension that was completely separated from the outside world, he still didn't know what it felt like to have such a space-time dimension. The world in their eyes, the world in their minds, and the state of chaos in their senses were all like. Because of this, almost every time he advanced, almost every time he grew, he would have a new discovery, and he would know new characteristics of a true sage. This perspective that transcended time was his most recent discovery. Under this perspective, time had become an existence that was like a fallen leaf, a stone, or a cloud in the sky. To him, the flow of time had become a completely ordinary change. It couldn't even cause any change to his mind or his senses. 100 trillion years, in an instant, was no different to him. There was no difference at all. As such, it could be said that the heart of eternal life was meaningless to a true divine. For an existence with an endless lifespan, the real deciding factor for how long they could live, apart from a number of enemies and the number of tribulations, was themselves, in the countless worlds and universes. Many beings with infinite lifespans couldn't stand the passage of time and eternal loneliness because they couldn't stand the passage of time. In the endless years, they couldn't find any change that could bring about an impulse in their minds. That was why they took the initiative to end their lives, causing their minds to collapse, and they died a violent death. And this ability to bear the endless time was the heart of immortality. To be truly eternal, one had to have this kind of heart of immortality. One had to find the joy of endless time in the endless years. This was the fundamental reason why a cultivator had to cultivate his mind. It was also a fundamental limitation that restricted the progress of a cultivator's realm. Although an existence that could cultivate to the level of Luo Fan, the heart of immortality was definitely extremely firm and unshakable. However, he still had the heart of longevity and was still limited by it. Take Luo Fan, for example. Perhaps there would not be any changes to his soul in 1,000,000,000,000 years. But what about 1,000,000,000,000,000 years? What about 1,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000,000 years? What if I add another 100 trillion? If this continued, there would come a day when he would find all the fun he could find, and he would definitely not be able to withstand the passage of time. At that time, his heart of eternal life would definitely collapse. Perhaps he would end his own life because of this. It directly turned into nothingness. This was the inevitable result of the longevity heart still being effective. This was also the fundamental reason why, since the beginning of time, so many cultivators had cultivated until they were just a little bit away from the true divine level. However, most of the living beings at the intermediate level had not truly reached the infinite level. Almost all of the living beings at this level chose to end their lives in some way because they could not bear the despair and loneliness of the passing of time, whether it was directly committing suicide. It was better to choose that illusory method of breakthrough that had an extremely low chance of success. In essence, it was all about ending one's life. However, it was obviously different now. When he truly saw the passage of time as an ordinary thing like a blade of grass and a tree, and equated billions of trillion years with an instant, the heart of longevity had obviously lost its effect. In this way, no matter how many billions of trillion years had passed, it would not leave any trace in Luo Fan's heart. In this way, even if Luo Fan had become an ordinary person, even if his soul had degenerated to the level of an ordinary person, he would still be able to live forever. He would not be unable to bear the various negative emotions brought about by the eternal life and commit suicide. Of course, all of this was simply the result of his deduction based on the perspective he had obtained. It should be known that Luo Fan had already set foot on the path to becoming a true divine. In this way, he would definitely encounter great tribulations again and again. In the end, he would either succeed in becoming a true divine, or his soul would be destroyed, and he would die a violent death. There was no other possibility. The eternal life and the perspective brought about by the heart of longevity did not mean much to him at all. All sorts of thoughts flashed through Luo Fan's mind, and he turned to look ahead. At this moment, he discovered a situation that he had not been able to discover before. The world in front of him seemed to have completely solidified, but in fact, inside it, there was a change that he had not noticed for billions of trillion years. It was an existence that could not be described with words. That existence, through a channel that could not be put into words, supported the entire world, supported the solidification of the entire world, and in the process produced an indescribable cycle. This kind of cycle was so complicated that even Luo Fan felt like he couldn't bear it at this time. His head was constantly swollen, as if it was about to explode and explode. Fortunately, at this time, his perspective had already changed, and his body was already many times stronger than before. Therefore, at this moment, although he felt swollen, he was still able to distinguish the various structures that were about to blow his head apart bit by bit. This is the power of a great tribulation. After an unknown period of time, Luo Fan understood in his heart. He already knew what kind of existence that could support and stabilize the entire world was. This world that he had entered was a world formed by his second great tribulation. At least, this world appeared in front of him because of his second great tribulation. Behind this world, there must be the power of the great tribulation itself at work. This power, no matter how deep it was hidden, no matter how obscure it was, or how incredible it was, at the end of the world, at the last moment of this world, at the very least, at the last moment of this world appearing in front of Luo Fan, there would definitely be traces of it. And these traces at this moment were the existence that constructed the incomparably complicated structure behind this world. When he discovered the traces of this power, Luo Fan couldn't help but feel an inexplicable joy in his heart. In an instant, he was frozen in real time, but in his body, who knew how many trillions of years had passed. Finally, he moved. This movement was a subtle adjustment of his body, causing the parts of his body that didn't conform to his worldview to gradually undergo subtle adjustments, gradually turning into a structure that was in line with his worldview. Compared to the original, there were more and more subtle differences. With the appearance of this change, a stronger and stronger sense of comfort gradually emerged in Luo Fan's heart. This sense of comfort made the power that had accumulated in his body for who knew how many trillions of years. Now, it had become vast and boundless, and a mysterious power that was enough to fill countless worlds seemed to have completely integrated with his body at this time, as if it had turned into blood. It clearly existed, but in his normal perception, it was an existence that had been ignored. After this, the solidification effect around him seemed to no longer have any effect on him. At this moment, in this completely solidified world, Luo Fan finally regained the ability to move, finally able to withstand the solidification mechanism of this world. Such a voice appeared in this world like a clap of thunder. This caused countless changes to occur in this world. Vaguely, the entire world seemed to have produced an indescribable vitality because of this, regarding this. But Luo Fan didn't care. With a thought, he lifted his foot and took a step forward. He had already moved forward hundreds of kilometers with ease. Another step, and he had already crossed tens of thousands of kilometers. With a third step, he had already left several light years behind him. With a fourth step, he had already traversed who knew how many trillions of light years and arrived at a position close to the center of this world. He appeared in front of his eyes, at the core of the power of the great calamity that supported the existence of this world in front of him. Under normal circumstances, this core seemed to be the most ordinary location in this world. There was no spirited mountain in the surroundings, nor were there any dangerous scenes. There was only an ordinary flat ground with sparse weeds growing on it. There were gravel of various sizes and streams of various sizes. "Come out," shouted Luo Fan softly as he raised his hand and pressed down on the flat ground in front of him. At this moment, endless power was released from his body in an instant and brazenly poured into the void at the position below. In that instant, the entire world erupted with this power, and countless disturbances spread out in all directions from this location. Because this kind of power was truly unfathomably profound, the transmission of this kind of movement far exceeded the speed that could be imagined. In the blink of an eye, it had already traversed an endless distance and spread to every location in this world, causing wind to suddenly appear in this world, the flow of time, the flow of power, the swaying of flowers and trees, the various activities of living beings, and even all sorts of strange sounds. It was as if the entire world had suddenly come to life. However, this was completely meaningless to Luo Fan now. Right now, he was wholeheartedly paying attention to the void in front of him. There a kind of collapse that did not even exist in this world appeared. As this collapse occurred, what changed was not this world, but that power. Even the owner of this power, Luo Fan, was affected. That power and Luo Fan gradually disappeared amid this change and gradually turned into nothingness. In a short while, Luo Fan felt that they had completely disappeared from this world. As the power and Luo Fan disappeared, the changes in this world froze again, just like before Luo Fan had appeared. It was unknown whether this was the scene of the instant the world was destroyed, or whether this was just the beginning of a new change, or whether this world was going to return to a level that no living being could understand. However, none of this had anything to do with Luo Fan anymore. At this moment, Luo Fan had already left this world. He reappeared in the world that he had created and returned to the place where his main body was. The moment his mind returned to his main body, endless power poured into his main body and suddenly integrated into it. It began to transform his main body frantically and fuse with it. This entire process completely surpassed time. It surpassed space and even everything. It was unknown whether it was billions of years or just a moment, but Luo Fan's main body had completely changed and become the embodiment of a nomological worldview. The flames that had always existed around him had gradually extinguished, and when he opened his eyes, they had completely disappeared. It's finally over. The second great calamity. Such words appeared in Luo Fan's mind at this moment. At this moment, the endless mysterious power that could fill an unknown number of billions of worlds from the great calamity had completely disappeared at this moment. Or rather, it had completely integrated into his body, becoming the driving force of his body's transformation. It had become a part of his body and could no longer be separated, let alone detected. And at this moment, he felt that compared to himself before the calamity, he was already countless times stronger. The perspective that he had obtained from the great calamity was equivalent to an instant. The perspective that he had obtained from the great calamity that equated billions of years to an instant. It was completely retained on him without any loss. His nomological worldview was also much purer than before. In other words, compared to before, he had been completely reborn. With a slight thought, everything in this world was already within his perception. In an instant, he knew how long he had spent to transcend the great calamity. Only 100 million years? Compared to the last time, it seems much faster. Not to mention the last time, even the time he had spent in the great calamity was many times longer than 100 million years. Compared to the outside world, only 100 million years had passed, which was already enough to make him satisfied. At this moment, an indescribable light was involuntarily released from Luo Fan's body. This light directly penetrated space-time, the layer of laws, the unseen world, and even the great Tao. It penetrated the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos, directly entering the state of chaos. For a moment, it was unknown how many mysteries of the state of chaos were transmitted to him through this light. Amidst these mysteries, Luo Fan was directly immersed. His nomological worldview seemed to have turned into a black hole and began to frantically absorb these mysteries. Through these mysteries, he gradually began to produce all kinds of subtle changes. These changes were so mysterious and incredible, but when used on his nomological worldview, Luo Fan completely understood them without any obstacles. Although there were no normal situations where he didn't know what they were, after all, that was his nomological worldview. It was the condensation of all his knowledge of the world, heaven and earth, all things, the state of chaos, and the state before the state of chaos. It could almost be said to be his soul, his everything. Naturally, he could understand the changes that were happening on it the fastest. And when the countless mysteries of the state of chaos seeped into the light, the entire world also produced all kinds of mysterious changes. The great Tao, the layers of laws, time, space, matter, all kinds of power, and even all the cultivators that existed in it were undergoing some kind of indescribable transformation. At this moment, somewhere in this world, 3 women suddenly stood in midair. Among the 3 women, 2 looked exactly the same. Although the other one was small and weak, she gave off an extraordinary sense of nobility. They were Meow and the two air maidens. He has successfully passed the great tribulation. The air maidens were extremely surprised and excited as they murmured. At this moment, the air maidens in the other space-time dimension were also surprised and said, "Doesn't this mean that I can return to my own space-time dimension?" It took him hundreds of millions of years to succeed. This speed is really too slow. Meow was very dissatisfied. However, at this moment, the two air maidens were no longer in the mood to care about her. They all raised their heads to look at the sky, looking at the source of the endless light that filled the entire world. In the eyes of all living beings and all cultivators in this world, there was a huge star that was tens of thousands of times brighter than the sun, but it was unexpectedly gentle. It didn't make people feel uncomfortable at all. At this moment, it was unknown how many surprised and bewildered voices reverberated between heaven and earth. It was unknown how many joyful and excited emotions were piling up. At some point in time, a vortex suddenly appeared in the highest part of the void. It began to slowly spin in the void, as if it was constantly extracting some mysterious existence from the light. Chapter 1827. It was a vortex materialized from the will of the world. It was obvious that the world will of this world was also yearning for the countless profundities contained within the chaotic state of the profound light. Along with this change, the world was faintly undergoing some sort of deeper and more mysterious change. In a trance, the intersection between the world and the earth seemed to have shrunk a little. Of course, this kind of shrunk on a mysterious conceptual level, but it wasn't the kind of shrunk that could be understood by ordinary people. If one had to describe it, it was more like the repulsive force between the world and the Earth's universe had increased. It was obvious that the absorption of the will of the world had caused the world to undergo some kind of deep upgrade. How is this possible? How can the will of the world appear because of this? Meow had a look of disbelief on his face as he stared at the vortex in the void. It was as if he was staring at a bottomless abyss. He felt as if his view of the world had been overturned. It must be known that although the will of the world possessed intelligence, its level of thinking was worlds apart from ordinary creatures. As a result, the things that ordinary living beings yearned for were completely meaningless to the will of the world. In other words, power, mysteries, and even precious treasures were no different from ordinary matter to the will of the world. No matter how many of them appeared, there wouldn't be much of a reaction from the will of the world. But at this moment, the will of the heavens and earth hung high up in the sky, like an ordinary infant craving for milk. It was trying its best to absorb the mysteries contained in the light, yearning for the mysterious principles that came from the chaotic state. What was the difference between it and ordinary creatures? This part of the world has sensed its destruction and is doing everything it can to save itself. At this moment, the air maiden saw through it and let out a long sigh. How is this possible? To the will of the world, destruction shouldn't be as terrifying as ordinary creatures. Kong Meow still couldn't believe it. He naturally knew that what the air maiden said made sense. She had walked through so many space-time dimensions, so she naturally knew that this world created by Luo Fan was inherently deficient. Through all kinds of miracles, he was able to survive the 8 tribulations of heaven and earth. This was already turning an impossible task into a possibility. It was impossible for this world to survive the 9th tribulation. In other words, the 9th tribulation of the heavens and earth was destined to be annihilation and destruction for this part of the world. It was precisely because of this that if this world was an ordinary creature, an ordinary cultivator, they would be able to save themselves. This was indeed the inevitable choice of this world. It was understandable that this world was behaving like this at this moment. However, there was nothing he could do. Heaven and earth were not living beings. The will of heaven and earth was not the will of living beings. Perhaps, for the wills of living beings, death and destruction were the world's greatest problems, their greatest fears. However, that was only from the perspective of the will of living beings, to the will of the world. Although she didn't understand what kind of angle it was and what level of change it was. But they were definitely different from living beings. For them, death was definitely not the same as living beings. It was definitely impossible for it to occupy a position as important as a living being. Perhaps, in its eyes, death and destruction might be another chance at rebirth. Hearing this, the empty maiden just smiled and said, "You're not this world. How do you know it won't be?" Meow was speechless after hearing this. This answer was simply shameless. If she continued to say this, there would be no end to it. This world has already lost its mark. This kind of difference might cause the will of the world to be different from other worlds. The empty maiden from the space-time dimension guessed. Hearing this, Meow felt that it made a lot of sense. However, he immediately cursed in his heart that it was nonsense. This was simply a matter of course. The abnormality of this world was, of course, because this world had lost its creator's mark. That was why some kind of change had occurred. However, what kind of change was that? Why would there be such a change? This was the key to the problem. Although the empty maiden from the space-time dimension seemed to have pointed out the key, in fact, she didn't say anything. If it wasn't nonsense, what was it? However, their words clearly meant that they didn't have an answer for him. Thus, Meow didn't bother to ask anymore. He just raised his head and looked at the vortex in the sky with an inexplicable gaze. All kinds of thoughts kept appearing in his mind, and they kept vanishing. Clearly, he was using his own wisdom and knowledge to find the answer to this question. This kind of light shone for 1,000 years. One day, after 1,000 years, a strange vibration swept through the entire world. Then, after the vibration, all the light disappeared. Along with the disappearance of the light, the vortex that had appeared out of thin air in the sky was the manifestation of the will of the world. When all these changes happened, the cultivators who had been completely immersed in the changes of the light for the past 1,000 years began to gradually wake up. All of them were extremely surprised to sense the changes in their bodies. All of them felt that the path in front of them seemed to have been expanded once again, and they vaguely realized that their future seemed to be much brighter. At the same time, the empty maiden and Meow, who each had their own thoughts somewhere in this world, also gradually came back to their senses. Just as they came back to their senses, the void in front of them shook slightly, and a figure appeared out of thin air in front of them. The figure was wearing a green robe. He looked extremely ordinary, but there was a kind of clarity about him that made anyone who saw him feel inexplicably satisfied and comfortable. It was none other than Luo Fan. "Are you done?" The empty maiden looked at Luo Fan and said as her body relaxed, "That's right, I'm done. You've worked hard these days." Luo Fan smiled and held the empty maiden's hand. He said as he felt the unimaginable warmth. In an instant, it seemed like only the two of them were left in this world. The entire world seemed to have become a lot brighter and warmer. At this moment, the empty maiden looked at Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension. There was a kind of joy in her eyes, but there was also an inexplicable sense of loss. This sense of loss was not because of Luo Fan, but because of him in a different space-time dimension. When she saw Luo Fan, she thought of him in a different space-time dimension, who she did not know when she would be able to see again. Her own cultivation partner. The empty maiden and Luo Fan did not get intimate for long before they recovered. Luo Fan first turned his head to look at the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension and said, "I know the space-time dimension you are in." The empty maiden's eyes lit up, and she said, "Then can you send me back?" "I can indeed send you back. However, you can choose whether you want to go back or not," Luo Fan said. The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension was about to say that she wanted to go back, but Luo Fan raised his hand to stop her. He said, "Don't decide yet. Let me show you what is happening in your space-time dimension." As he spoke, he waved his hand. A world was instantly opened up in front of him. There was no smoke or fire in the entire process. It was as if this world had always been there. His brush merely wiped away the dust that had previously covered this world. The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension could not help but feel nervous at this moment. Go. This is what I saw when I looked at many space-time dimensions. Everything inside is happening right now, Luo Fan said faintly. At this moment, the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension took a deep breath and stepped into the artifact. In the blink of an eye, she disappeared from that world. At this moment, the empty maiden did not say anything at all. For her, as long as Luo Fan was fine, everything else was secondary. Even if it was something happening in a different space-time dimension, she would not care about it. They waited like this for a long time. That world collapsed with a loud bang. The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension materialized and gradually appeared in front of them. I want to go back. Immediately. After appearing, she said immediately, "Do you know what is happening in that space-time dimension now?" Luo Fan asked calmly. "I know there. It is undergoing the 8th heaven and earth calamity. Moreover, it seems that the possibility of successfully passing through this heaven and earth calamity is quite small." The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension said, "All right, since you have made up your mind, I will send you there." Luo Fan did not say anything else. He just said calmly, "Why do you still want to go there if you already know?" The reason why he was uneasy was because he already knew the answer. Of course, it was also because the answer did not mean anything to him. The reason why he gave her a choice was because she and the empty maiden had established a rather deep friendship over the past 100 million years. At this moment, the empty maiden's pupils shrank. Looking at the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension, her eyes were filled with worry and pity. After traveling together for more than 100 million years, she already had a very good understanding of the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension. She even had a good understanding of a Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension. Therefore, she was very clear that the Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension did not have the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light. Because he did not have the innate, inextinguishable spiritual light, if he could not successfully pass through the heaven and earth calamity, the probability of him dying was quite high, at least 20 to 30%. Under such circumstances, if the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension returned to that space-time dimension, she would definitely be heading to her death. The probability of her death was at least 20 to 30% higher than that of Luo Fan. However, although she knew this and felt that there was no need for the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension to return, she could not say such words of advice in the end. Because she clearly knew how deep her feelings for the Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension were. It was not inferior to the depth of her feelings for Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension. In this way, no matter what she said, it was impossible to change her mind and let the Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension face the heaven and earth calamity alone, which had a 20 to 30% chance of death. "You take care." The empty maiden sighed and said to the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension, "Don't worry, I will definitely be fine. When he can freely travel to any space-time dimension, perhaps we will come to visit you." The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension smiled. Hearing this, the empty maiden also smiled and said, "Perhaps we don't have to wait for you to have this ability. After a period of time, perhaps we will go to your space-time dimension to visit you." At this moment, Luo Fan just smiled faintly. However, he did not interrupt their conversation. He did not promise to go to that space-time dimension, nor did he refuse to go at this moment. When Miao saw Luo Fan's expression, her pupils involuntarily shrank and an inexplicable surprise flashed in her eyes. The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension smiled and nodded. After the two of them talked for a while, she asked Luo Fan to leave this space-time dimension. Luo Fan nodded. With a thought, they directly came to a mysterious place without any smoke or fire. Throughout the whole process, no matter which empty maiden, even when Miao didn't sense any fluctuations or anything out of the ordinary. It was as if it was not them who had changed positions, but the whole world, the whole heaven and earth. I didn't expect it to become so powerful. At this moment, such a thought flashed in Miao's mind. Her eyes were filled with even more intense anticipation. This place was the place where the misty space had been. It was also the place where Luo Fan had gone through the second Great Tribulation. However, this place was completely empty at this moment. There was no misty space at all. It was just an empty space. After arriving here, Luo Fan did not hesitate and casually grabbed the void. Then, he pulled hard as if he had used all his strength. The void began to shake violently along with his movements. It was as if some unimaginable and terrifying existence was gradually emerging from the void. All sorts of loud noises started to gradually spread out at this moment, pouring into the ears of everyone present. This is... The empty maiden's eyes were filled with joy. The empty maiden in a different space-time dimension was filled with anticipation. Only when Meow had a disappointed look in her eyes. At this moment, the movement in front of them became louder and louder. Finally, with an earth-shattering thunderclap, a space appeared. It appeared in front of them. The interior of this space was misty. They could not see the specific scene at all, but it seemed as if there were countless scenes mixed together and filled up the space. It really is this misty space. The empty maiden let out a long sigh of relief. This, impressively, Luo Fan had forcibly captured the misty space that was the intersection of many space-time dimensions. It could even be said that it had been broken off, or rather, he had reconstructed it. In this way, the empty maiden in a different space-time dimension would naturally have no problem returning to her own space-time dimension. In fact, she could even use her own ability to cross the space-time dimension and return to her own space-time dimension. So that's it. At this moment, when Meow was even more disappointed. She originally thought that Luo Fan would use some method to send the empty maiden back to her own space-time dimension. She even thought that his strength had surpassed the space-time dimension, and he might be able to send her back to the higher space-time dimension where she was born. However, she did not expect that Luo Fan would merely recreate the original misty space. In this case, although it was already an extremely incredible ability, it was ultimately not enough to send her back to her own space-time dimension and let her go home. If it could be done, why did she come to this space-time dimension in the first place? Couldn't she just return to her own space-time dimension through this misty space? However, while they were either surprised, expectant, or disappointed, Luo Fan did not stop moving. He let out a soft shout and changed his previous grabbing motion into a forward slap. In an instant, an indescribable power was released from his body and brazenly slapped the misty space that had appeared in front of him. In an instant, the misty space began to shake violently. The originally misty space began to churn rapidly. Countless unpredictable lights and shadows appeared in the space in an instant. In a trance, the empty maiden and Meow seemed to see some familiar figures appear. Then, strange sounds came from the misty space. It seemed to be crackling, but also like a buzzing sound. It was as if some mysterious existence was shattering, but also as if some extremely mysterious thing was being born. In a short while, the entire misty space had been compressed into a bronze door that was 30 feet in size. It stood quietly in the void, quietly appearing in front of them. This bronze door did not have a door panel and was directly opened. Through this door, they could see the deeper misty space behind it. It was as if it had been compressed to the extreme and turned into the deepest darkness. When Luo Fan saw this, his heart stirred. He raised his hand and pointed. 2 door panels appeared out of thin air in front of this door. They were seamless and instantly covered the door. As the door panels appeared, the door began to make buzzing sounds. This sound spread out and was heard by the entire world. It caused the entire world to tremble slightly because of this sound. In fact, when Meow could sense that this sound seemed to have rushed into the space-time dimension and was transmitted to an unknown number of space-time dimensions. Chapter 1828. Rex. As when Meow changed his mind, the sound coming from the door gradually subsided. Fast updates, refreshing website page, few advertisements. I like this kind of website the most. You must give me a good review. In the end, all sounds disappeared. The door finally stabilized in the void in front of them, emitting an eternal and unmoving aura. It was as if the door had been there since the beginning of the world. It was as if even if the world was destroyed, the door would still exist. As long as you push open the door, you'll be able to return to your space-time dimension, Luo Fan said to Air Maiden, who was in a different space-time dimension. His expression was rather solemn, but there was no sign of fatigue on his face. It was as if condensing and transforming the misty space into a space-time dimensional portal was as simple as brushing off the dust on his shoulders. At this moment, the air hostess in the alternate space-time dimension looked excited, nervous, expectant, and worried. She took a deep breath and said to Luo Fan, "Thank you." As he spoke, he stepped forward and slowly pressed his hand on the door. In the blink of an eye, the door produced an indescribable suction force that acted on Space Maiden, who was in a different space-time dimension. This kind of suction force was not targeted at power, nor was it targeted at existences like blood essence. Instead, it was targeted at a more mysterious existence, the aura of the space-time dimension. As this suction continued, Wamiao, who had a stronger sense of space-time dimensions, could clearly feel some kind of mysterious wave sweeping through one space-time dimension after another, again and again. Finally, after a few breaths, he finally locked onto a certain space-time dimension. As the space-time dimension was locked, the suction force emitted by the door naturally disappeared. Immediately afterward, the two sides of the door loosened, and with a gentle push from the Space Maiden, the door was opened, revealing a murky area. "This is my space-time dimension." Looking at this dusky place in a different space-time dimension, an indescribable sense of familiarity surged in her heart. She said so. Wamiao tilted her head to look at the dusky area with an indescribable look of doubt on her face. In her eyes, that dusky existence was faintly discernible. It seemed to exist, but it also seemed to not exist. In the blink of an eye, it had turned into a screen of light and a barrier. It was unpredictable and extremely strange. "What is this place? Why is it so strange?" she muttered. Luo Fan and the two stewardesses felt that it was natural for her to have such a strange feeling when she looked at the scene behind the door, but none of them explained it to her. Because this grayish existence was none other than the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. Only existences like Luo Fan and Air Maiden could observe this gap. Other cultivators, even if they were disciples of a true divine, would not be able to detect the existence of this gap because they did not have such thoughts in their hearts. Although Wamiao came from a higher space-time dimension, he didn't understand the existence of the gap. Naturally, it was impossible for him to truly observe the existence of this gap. At this time, the reason why they could occasionally see the grayish existence was because Luo Fan had opened the door there. Once the door was opened, there would be a direct impact. Of course, there were also living beings from a higher space-time dimension who had an overlooking view of everything in a lower space-time dimension. Therefore, although she couldn't observe the existence of this gap, she could still sense it. That was why she could occasionally see its existence at this time. "Take care." Air Maiden looked at herself in a different space-time dimension and said, "Super many good novels." The Air Maiden in a different space-time dimension smiled at Air Maiden and nodded. She also said "take care" before stepping through the door and crashing into the grayish existence. Then, she tore open the barrier between heaven and earth and the gap. She stepped into the gap and entered the world that was undergoing the eighth tribulation of heaven and earth. At the moment when the barrier was torn open, Luo Fan and Air Maiden saw an extremely tragic scene. Boundless flames of annihilation filled the world. All kinds of wails, cries, and roars filled the sky. Within the endless flames, there was a figure that wasn't big, but it emitted an endless aura. The figure that seemed to be able to suppress heaven and earth stood high above, using its supreme power to suppress the boundless flames with all its might. It fought with all its might against the countless terrifying creatures that were born from the flames. "Why are you here?" At this moment, a voice that was both surprised and worried came from the figure. That voice was extremely familiar to any one of the three people present. That was the voice of Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension. I found a way home, so of course I came back. The air maiden in a different space-time dimension smiled sweetly. There was an indescribable light radiating from her body. An indescribable feeling of satisfaction and joy radiated from this light. At this moment, a spiritual light descended from the sky and enveloped the air maiden in a different space-time dimension. With a pull, it penetrated the endless sea of flames and appeared next to her. Then, two gazes pierced through the layers of barriers and saw the door in the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos. They also saw Luo Fan, the air maiden, and Meow behind the door. I didn't expect you to reach this step. You're far stronger than me. At this moment, a sentence penetrated the endless barriers and reached Luo Fan's ears. Luo Fan smiled and said, I'm just a step ahead. If you can get through this disaster, you'll reach this step one day. Don't worry, I'll definitely get through this disaster. The Luo Fan in a different space-time dimension smiled. Although he wanted to say a few more words, he kept his mouth shut in the end. After all, that world was undergoing the 8th tribulation at this moment, and he had to give it his all. Otherwise, the slightest carelessness might cause the world to be destroyed, and his hard work over the course of countless trillions of years would be for naught. It was even to the extent that both of them might be in danger of death. Under such circumstances, how could they have much time to chat? Luo Fan also knew this. After saying a few words, he stopped and told him to take care. Then, he casually brushed the door. In an instant, the two doors were closed. Sizzle, sizzle, sizzle. With a soft sound, the connection between the door and the space-time dimension was completely cut off. In the space-time dimension, the door that originally appeared in the gap between heaven and earth and the state of chaos disappeared completely. It also completely disappeared without a trace, as if it had never appeared in the first place. Are you really not going to help them? If you take action, the 8th tribulation of the heavens and earth should be easily passed, right? At this moment, when Meow said from behind Luo Fan, help them? Luo Fan only shook his head and smiled. If I help, I can indeed help the world to get through the 8th disaster. However, if I do that, that space-time dimension will definitely be contaminated with the aura of this space-time dimension. At that time, the connection between the two space-time dimensions will become tighter. One day they might collide. At that time, no matter which space-time dimension it is, it will be a huge disaster. Hearing this, when Meow frowned and said, how is that possible? I have never heard of such a thing. As a visitor from a higher space-time dimension, when Meow had the right to question him, Luo Fan only shook his head and said, although you come from a higher space-time dimension, the only thing that is stronger than us is the composition of your body. In terms of understanding of the space-time dimension, you are not as good as me. There was no arrogance in his words, nor was there any sense of superiority. But it made people clearly feel his confidence. Let people clearly feel his confidence in his own ability. Facing this scene, how could Meow agree? She had a high understanding of the space-time dimension. This was what she was most proud of. It was also the advantage that she thought she had in front of Luo Fan and the air hostess. If she admitted that she was not as good as Luo Fan, wouldn't she be trampled underfoot? At that moment, she retorted, you are too confident. After we were born, we came into contact with the secrets of the space-time dimension. You're a creature that grew up in a lower space-time dimension. How can you compare me? Is that so? Then, can you refine this dimensional door? Luo Fan lightly pointed at the door in front of him and said. Hearing this, Meow's expression began to change. First, it turned red, then it inexplicably turned white, and finally turned black. This rebuttal was too powerful. It was so powerful that she could not find any way to refute it. It was so powerful that she convinced herself to admit that what the other party said made sense. All right, didn't you want him to help you go home? Why are you arguing with him again? The air hostess, who was watching their conversation from the side, said with a smile at this time. Hearing this, Meow found a way out of this embarrassing situation. Well, that's right. I still need to rely on you to go home, so I won't argue with you for now. Luo Fan just smiled and shook his head. He did not continue to argue about who was stronger and who was weaker. He said, "Your space-time dimension is not parallel to the space-time dimensions that I have experienced before. It is at a higher level. With my current ability, I am still unable to send you there." "What?" Well, Meow exclaimed when she heard this. "You can't do it? Then what should I do?" Luo Fan just said, "This can't be helped. The difference between the levels of space-time dimensions is unimaginable. Although I have a considerable understanding of space-time dimensions now, it is still not enough to communicate with higher space-time dimensions." Well, Meow did not want to lose hope and said, "Is there really no other way?" "At least, I haven't thought of it for the time being," Luo Fan just said. This finally made Meow despair. "Even you can't do it. Am I really unable to go home forever?" As she spoke, the aura on her body began to become chaotic. It randomly attacked and struggled in all directions, causing countless lights and shadows to appear in the blink of an eye. All kinds of strange scenes of fighting could be vaguely seen. At this moment, Meow had experienced more than 100 million years of walking and cultivating in this world with the two air hostesses. Her cultivation realm had already risen to the false saint level. Although it was still nothing compared to Luo Fan and the air hostesses, she was already tens of thousands of times stronger than before. In this state, even if the ability to control space-time dimensions brought about by the higher space-time dimensions was sealed, she could still cause earth-shattering damage. Fortunately, at this moment, Luo Fan and the air hostesses were beside her. Seeing the chaotic aura on her body, they each had a thought. All the changes here were completely suppressed in the surroundings and did not spread out casually, affecting the space-time of the outside world. "Wake up!" A soft shout came from Luo Fan's mouth. In an instant, Meow's body shook, and her mind woke up from the chaotic state. Her aura quickly converged, and in the blink of an eye, she had completely returned to normal. "Although I can't send you home immediately, if you're willing, I can send you to the nearest space-time dimension to your home." Luo Fan thought for a while. He said, hearing this, Meow's eyes lit up. "Is there really a way?" "There's indeed a way. However, you don't have to get your hopes up. That place is different from what you imagined," Luo Fan said. Hearing this, Meow did not care about anything else and hurriedly said, "I want to go." At this moment, the air hostesses also looked at Luo Fan reproachfully. She blamed him for not making it clear before, causing Meow to worry and panic for so long. Luo Fan could only smile bitterly. It was not that he did not want to make it clear before, but that space-time dimension was quite special. Although it was extremely close to the higher space-time dimension, it was not a good place to go after all. Given Meow's identity and ability, it was not suitable for her to go there. However, since Meow wanted to go, he wouldn't refuse. He just said, "Since you want to go, why don't you go?" He just said, "Since you want to go, we will go with you. If you want to come back, we can bring you back at any time." Meow just nodded. As Luo Fan said this, he casually waved his hand at the door in front of him. In an instant, the door began to tremble slightly. Faintly, there seemed to be the sound of machinery operating within it. An inexplicable wave was emitted from the door and began to sweep across the various space-time dimensions. However, this time, the direction of the wave was not sweeping in all directions like before. Instead, it converged into one. It swept in a certain direction. In the beginning, Meow could still sense the direction of the wave and the existence at the front of the wave. However, it didn't take long for her to realize that the undulations had already surpassed her senses and the scope of her understanding. She could only sense that the undulations were continuously advancing, but she didn't know where exactly they were going. Noticing this change, Meow's heart was filled with more hope. If that's the case, maybe it can really get close to my space-time dimension. This process lasted for a long time. Finally, at a certain moment, the wave subsided and the dimensional door in front of them began to tremble slightly. It seemed to be moving forward at a rapid speed. This went on for a long time. After a trembling sound, the door finally completely stabilized. It seemed as if nothing had happened before, standing in front of them. "We're here," Luo Fan said. At this moment, although his expression was calm, there was a little more seriousness in his eyes. Clearly, the space-time dimension behind the dimensional door was also giving him a lot of pressure. He could no longer be as relaxed as he was when facing other space-time dimensions. At this moment, Wamiao's expression was rather expectant, while the Air Maiden's expression was also a little nervous. Luo Fan held the Air Maiden's hand and said, "Let's go over. The situation there is quite complicated, but you have to be careful. With you around, I don't have to worry about anything." The Air Maiden smiled sweetly. Hearing this, Luo Fan's heart was filled with heroism. He smiled and said, "That's right. You don't have to worry about anything." Then he casually patted the door, and it opened with a loud bang. In the blink of an eye, an indescribable pressure was released from the door. The boundless void around the door suddenly began to distort, as if the air around a flame had begun to distort under the scorching heat of the flame. At the same time, this side of the world began to tremble slightly, as if a heavy object that exceeded what it could bear had suddenly been pressed down on it. Luo Fan had already expected this kind of pressure. At this moment, he did not hesitate, nor did he stop. He took a step forward and stepped into the door. Although Wamiao was intimidated by the pressure, in the end, he still couldn't resist the call of home. He immediately followed behind Luo Fan and crossed the door. As the three of them entered, the door instantly closed. The pressure that was released from the door instantly disappeared. The distortion around the door completely disappeared at this moment, and the void returned to normal. As a result, the trembling of the world completely disappeared, as if it had never appeared in the first place. What's going on with this world? Why are there such unimaginable changes from time to time? At this moment, Xiao Daozi, who was cultivating somewhere in this world, furrowed his brows as such a thought flashed through his mind. In that instant, he felt that his spirit had become extremely oppressive, as if an indescribably terrifying existence had swept its gaze over him. There was an indescribable sense of crisis. Before he could react, this unusual phenomenon had completely disappeared, causing him to even suspect if everything that had happened before was just a misconception on his part. Chapter 1829. This was an incomparably strange world. The entire world was constantly changing, as though there were countless space-times. Countless heavens and earth intertwined to form this world. Luo Fan, air hostess Wamiao, and the other two who had stepped into this world were enduring endless pressure at this moment. In a trance, it was as though the entire world was pressing down on them. This is the space-time dimension closest to my home. Wamiao looked at this world in disbelief. This world was completely like the space-time dimension after the space-time dimension had been disrupted. It was not even comparable to the lowest space-time dimension. How could it be the closest to the higher space-time dimension of her home? That's right. This space-time dimension is the closest space-time dimension to the higher space-time dimension that I can sense, Luo Fan said faintly. With a thought, he casually waved his hand behind him. In an instant, the dimensional door suddenly closed and instantly turned into a tightly shut door. Then, it gradually shrank and eventually became the size of a fist. It fell into his hand, and he put it away. Wamiao hesitated and was momentarily speechless. Although she did not believe that this was the closest space-time dimension to the higher space-time dimension, she knew that an existence like Luo Fan was not the kind of person who would speak without thinking. Since he had said so, there must be some basis for it. However, she could not see the existence of such a basis at this moment. Hence, she remained silent. The space-time dimension here is very chaotic. At this moment, the air hostess said, although there was endless pressure around them that was suppressing them, among the three of them, all of them had reached an extremely high level. Under such circumstances, although the pressure was terrifying, it was ultimately not beyond their tolerance range. Hence, they only had a thought and slightly changed their bodies. He had already withstood the pressure, and it looked no different from a normal situation. The air hostess words reminded Wamiao to start observing this world from the perspective that she was most familiar with. Through this observation, she discovered the uniqueness of this world. This world, it was simply formed by the combination of countless space-time dimensions in an extremely mysterious way. The space-time dimension of this world was not like the other worlds that she had experienced before. It was completely unique. Instead, it was a world formed by billions and trillions of space-time dimensions combined together in a strange way. Just as the three of them were observing this world, suddenly, from the absolute chaos of light and shadows, a figure appeared. All of a sudden, a strange creature appeared not far away from them, pushing aside countless light shadows. This creature was extremely strange. It had the form of a human, but its form was fundamentally different from that of a born Taoism aptitude. Every part of his body was slightly inferior to a born Taoism figure. When put together, there was a world of difference between him and a born Taoism figure. No matter how one looked at it, it was awkward and strange. After this creature appeared, it saw Luo Fan, Space Maiden, and Meow. There was a look of surprise in his eyes. Then, with a loud roar, he raised his hand and grabbed at the void around him. Suddenly, he flung it toward the three of them. No! At this moment, the part of the light shadow caught in his palm was like a net. He grabbed it and flung it towards Luo Fan and the other two. At this moment, the originally illusory light shadow suddenly became real, erupting with a power that was different from that of any other creature. It directly entangled the three of them. This is the power of the space-time dimension. At this moment, Space Maiden's eyes lit up. The method in front of them actually had the effect of using the power of the higher space-time dimension. Although, compared to the true way of using the power of the higher space-time dimension, it was, after all, a way of using the power of the lower space-time dimension. At this moment, she finally truly believed that this space-time dimension had to be extremely close to the higher space-time dimension. At this moment, the figure said, "We've finally caught a few big fish that can transcend." At this moment, the three of them felt as if they were about to be completely enveloped by countless worlds. At this moment, Luo Fan smiled faintly and raised his hand to point at the net-like light shadow that was pouncing toward them. As he pointed, an indescribable power was released from his hand. It directly penetrated the space-time dimension and hit the net, or rather, the light shadow. Chi-chi-chi-chi. As light sounds rang out, the light shadow suddenly collapsed. The power of the space-time dimension contained within it suddenly shook and completely dissipated. At this moment, the figure revealed a look of disbelief, and there was even indescribable fear in its eyes. At this moment, Luo Fan raised his hand and made a grabbing motion. An invisible power directly enveloped the figure. All the power in the figure's body, including the basic method of using the space-time dimension, instantly failed. In the blink of an eye, the figure had lost all its power. As Luo Fan smiled faintly, the figure had already been caught and brought before him. "Check his memories yourself," Luo Fan said after tossing the figure to Meow. Hearing this, Meow hurriedly nodded and grabbed the figure. She began to pour her power into the figure and flipped through it continuously. After a long while, she finally let go of the figure. As she let go, the figure let out a miserable shriek. With a loud bang, it dissipated. In the process of its dissipation, there was no leakage of power, and there was no explosion of anything like crushed flesh. There were only countless light shadows that seemed to be layers of the space-time dimension that formed Meow's body. As his entire body completely dissipated, the surrounding light and shadow became even more complicated. "This world is at the bottom of the countless space-time dimensions," Meow said. "The bottom?" The air hostess frowned. The bottom and the higher space-time dimensions were in two different directions. This was different from what they had previously agreed on. "That's right, it is indeed the bottom. However, just like how there is a fine line between a lunatic and a genius, there is also a fine line between this place and the higher space-time dimensions." Meow nodded. Then, a helpless expression appeared on her face. "I didn't expect it to be here. I never thought about it from this angle. I never knew that this could be a shortcut to return to my own space-time dimension. If I had known, I might have been able to enter this place long ago. Why did you enter this place so early?" Isn't this place outside of your range of perception? The air hostess frowned. When Meow's words were clearly saying that if she had thought of it long ago, she would not have needed Luo Fan. There was no need for Luo Fan at all. He could solve the problem by himself. The air hostess obviously did not take this to heart. This place is actually the gathering point of countless space-time dimensional fragments. In other words, after the countless space-time dimensions shattered, the fragments continued to settle and sink until they finally converged at a place. Although I can't sense this place, as long as I can dig out a fragment of a space-time dimension and hide in it, I will eventually be able to fall here, when Meow said. When the air hostess heard this, although she was a little unhappy, she still nodded and agreed with Meow's words. Then what about these creatures? These creatures are actually creatures that have transcended from the space-time dimension because of the countless years of evolution. In the end, they were assimilated by this space-time dimension and grew into what they are today. They previously regarded us as creatures that had just transcended from the space-time dimension fragments. When Meow sighed. While they were talking, Luo Fan had been quietly standing by the side and did not interrupt their conversation. At his current level, the moment he stepped into this space-time dimension, he had already completely comprehended the essence of the space-time dimension. In fact, he didn't even need to step into this place. He had already gained a preliminary understanding of this space-time dimension when he used his senses to sense the other space-time dimensions in his own space-time dimension. This was also the fundamental reason why he brought Meow and Space Maiden into this space-time dimension. It was precisely because he already had such an understanding of the space-time dimension. Thus, he naturally did not need to listen to Meow's explanation of the space-time dimension. "We need to leave this place," he said. The Air Maiden was just about to ask something when she heard Luo Fan's words and couldn't help but be startled. At that moment, he nodded without hesitation and said, "Then let's go quickly. It is indeed time to leave this place. There are tens of millions of races in this dimension, and this is the territory of a race called the Dimensional Race. We killed that Dimensional Race person just now, and this should have alerted the Dimensional Race. They will find us very soon," Meow said. Since Meow had explained it clearly, Luo Fan naturally didn't want to talk nonsense. With a thought, he brought the two of them and took a light step forward. In the blink of an eye, they had already crossed an unknown number of space-time dimensions. In this world that was completely formed by many space-time dimension fragments, the space-time dimension was used to calculate distance, and not the ordinary distance measurement unit. In the blink of an eye, they had already arrived at a completely unfamiliar place. Here, the surrounding light and shadow seemed to be rather orderly, and there was no more chaos like before. "There's a city here," Luo Fan said with a smile. "City?" Air Maiden was extremely curious about the city in this world, and she couldn't help but ask. "That's right. This city should have been built by a powerful creature. Here, we can see countless creatures of this world. We can also find the way to transcend this world," Luo Fan said with a smile. "If this world transcended further, it would be the higher space-time dimension." Although Luo Fan had comprehended many of the essence of this world after stepping into this space-time dimension, his cultivation and understanding of the way to transcend this world were definitely inferior to the accumulation of billions of years in this world. Under such circumstances, if he wanted to find the way to transcend this world as soon as possible, he could only start with the creatures of this world. The way to transcend this world. Meow's eyes were extremely bright at this moment. Transcending this world would allow one to return to the higher space-time dimension. Therefore, to her, the way to transcend this world was the way to return home. How could she not care about it? Yes, we need to modify ourselves. Otherwise, it will be too conspicuous. Luo Fan looked at the two of them, and with a thought, he waved his hand, and the three of them were completely covered with a layer of strange power. Under the cover of this layer of power, the three of them emitted an aura that belonged to this space-time dimension. It was an aura that had been assimilated by the space-time dimension. The essence of their bodies had transformed into the aura of existences of the space-time dimension. The existence of this aura made the three of them look no different from the creatures of this world. In this way, no matter which city they entered in this world, they would no longer be suspected of being creatures that had just transcended from the space-time dimension. After putting on the disguise, the three of them began to head toward the city that Luo Fan sensed. After a short while, they traversed some space-time dimensions and finally saw the city clearly. This city was completely different from any city that Space Maiden and Meow had seen before. This city was completely constructed by all kinds of ever-changing lights and shadows. Among these lights and shadows, there were countless creatures, countless experts, and even innumerable material existences. However, these were just like the bricks and tiles of this city. Above these countless lights and shadows, there were all kinds of strange creatures going in and out. Occasionally, they would gather in twos and threes to talk and trade. Some of them would even grab wisps of strange space-time dimensions from a certain light or eat and drink. Or they would transform them into something and sell them to others. This is a city? Space Maiden looked at Luo Fan in disbelief. The whole city did not look like a city at all. Instead, it looked more like It looked more like the gathering point of some creator gods, those lights and shadows, as well as the countless scenes that spread out like buildings, were like worlds that were created by the creator gods to provide all kinds of effects. And the creatures that lived during this period were like the creator gods. That's right, this is a city. Luo Fan just smiled. At this moment, Meow's face was filled with doubt and joy. This city, vaguely, it already has some characteristics of our space-time dimension. She muttered, "Who built this city? Did he fall from a higher space-time dimension? Is the city in your world also like this?" Space Maiden frowned and said, "This kind of city seemed to be of an extremely high level. However, the way it treated the world, the creatures, and the space-time dimension so lowly obviously dissatisfied her. Of course, it looks completely different. But in essence, it's almost the same," Meow said. "I don't like your space-time dimension," Space Maiden said. "It can't be helped if you don't like it. The higher space-time dimension that is built on many lower space-time dimensions can only be like this," Meow said helplessly. There were many creatures in this city. There were all kinds of them. With so many living beings and so many different species, it was naturally impossible for any newcomers to arrive. Everyone would pay attention to them. Therefore, when Luo Fan and the other two stepped into this city, they did not attract much attention. Not many people even glanced at them. This allowed them to go deep into the city as they pleased to find the creature that built this city. After walking for a while, they really entered the city. Luo Fan pulled a creature that was leisurely passing by and opened his mouth to ask some questions. This creature was not in a hurry. Although he was not overly enthusiastic, he was not a cold person either. After Luo Fan showed him enough respect, he did not hide much and told Luo Fan what he wanted to know. After a while, Luo Fan thanked him and left. There's a courtyard in the center of this city. The creature that built this city has been staying by that courtyard for a long time. Let's go there now," Luo Fan said to Meow and Space Maiden with a smile. The heavenly well was naturally not a well of an ordinary world. Instead, it led straight to the extreme, as if it was a cylindrical existence that extended down from an extremely high place above countless dimensions of space and time. From time to time, fragments of a certain space-time dimension would fall from this courtyard and enrich this city. In other words, it would enrich this space-time dimension and this world. To the creatures in this world, the fragments of the space-time dimension were the foundation of everything. All of their activities were inseparable from the fragments of the space-time dimension. Whether it was cultivation or survival, whether it was buying or selling, they all needed the fragments of the space-time dimension. Because of this, the courtyard that could produce fragments of the space-time dimension could be said to be the most precious resource production area in this city. Controlling the atrium was equivalent to controlling the entire city. It was precisely because of this that the founder of this city had chosen to guard it. Why are the fragments concentrated in that courtyard? Space Maiden frowned and asked. Normally, when fragments of the space-time dimension fell into this space-time dimension, their distribution should be random. Any place could be hit by the fragments. Chapter 1830. So that's how it is. The air hostess came to a sudden realization. This world itself was formed by the combination of many space-time dimensional fragments. Everything in this world couldn't escape this category. The city in front of them was naturally no exception. If some dimensional fragments fell from the sky from time to time and hit this city, wouldn't it be equivalent to an ordinary city being hit by meteorites every 2 to 3 days? No matter how valuable the meteorites were, they wouldn't be able to withstand it, right? It was precisely because of this that if they wanted this city to stabilize and survive for a long time, they naturally had to solve the problem of these dimensional fragments falling randomly. In this case, using a certain method to gather the fragments and make them fall at a fixed location was the best solution. It was like using a certain place as a place to collect meteorites. That was definitely playing to the strengths and avoiding the weaknesses. Unknowingly, the three of them had already approached the center of the city. Suddenly, two creatures emerged from behind one of the images. They raised their hands to stop the three of them and said, "Stop. This is the courtyard. Unauthorized people are not allowed to approach." Luo Fan only smiled faintly and said, "I want to meet with the city lord. Please inform him." As he spoke, a trace of light flashed in his eyes. This light emitted an indescribable pressure and directly pressed down on the two creatures in front of them. At this moment, it was as if the two creatures had suddenly turned into the most ordinary creatures and had been thrown into a cage of ferocious beasts. They felt goosebumps all over their bodies, and in a trance, they felt as if they were going to be completely torn apart in the next moment. This feeling disappeared as quickly as it came. It didn't take long for the two of them to recover. However, after recovering, they also clearly knew how powerful the three people in front of them were. If they wanted to deal with them, they didn't even need to move. They only needed to think about it. Once they thought about it, they would probably die and their souls would scatter. There was no possibility of them surviving. At this moment, they couldn't reprimand them anymore. The two of them looked at each other and directly bowed. They said, "Please wait for a moment, esteemed guests. We will immediately go and inform them." Then, the two of them quickly turned around and went back into the light, directly disappearing from the three's line of sight. "Can we just go there?" Well, Meow asked in confusion. Based on the strength of the three of them, there was almost no existence in this world that could resist them. With such strength, it would be normal for them to sweep through the entire world. Under such circumstances, why was there a need to be so courteous and notify them beforehand? In this world, it seems that we are indeed invincible. After all, this was a completely unfamiliar dimension. It was impossible to say what was hidden within. It's better to keep a low profile. Luo Fan just smiled. Said, after he stepped into this space-time dimension, he could clearly feel the profoundness of this space-time dimension. On the surface, the level of power was not considered high, but there seemed to be many secrets hidden behind it. He vaguely felt some kind of indescribable pressure. That was why he restrained his usual direct style and did his best to follow the rules of this world. Soon, the two people from before reappeared in front of them. The city lord invites the three esteemed guests. The person who spoke just now said respectfully. In his eyes, there was still fear for Luo Fan, but he forcibly suppressed it. He just did not show it. Luo Fan just smiled faintly and said, "Please lead the way." Then he followed the two of them into the city lord's mansion that was formed by countless light shadows. After stepping into the mansion, there were many light shadows. The space-time dimension was combined in an extremely unusual way to form a strange world. In it, there were many living creatures doing all kinds of things in an orderly manner. For example, the gardener's work, the servant's work, and the guard's work. After some comparison, Luo Fan and the others quickly understood the effects of the various areas. The space-time dimension fragment in front of them was the living room. Not far from it was the guard's room, and next to it was the servant's room. The two guards led Luo Fan and the others through several space-time dimensions and arrived next to an atrium. There was only a deep pit formed by the pure space-time dimension's strange power. Above the pit was the exit of the atrium. At this moment, there was a living creature floating quietly beside the deep pit. He stretched out his hands and grabbed at the deep pit in front of him, as if he was pulling something extremely heavy out of it. This living creature exuded a kind of calmness and confidence. Just by looking at him, one could feel that everything was under his control. "I'm sorry, a high-quality fragment fell just now, so I couldn't personally welcome the esteemed guests. Please forgive me." The living creature smiled apologetically when he sensed the arrival of Luo Fan and the others. Luo Fan swept his gaze over and discovered that the strength of this living creature was only at the false sage level. However, with the support of the special use of space-time dimensions, even a Supreme Emperor would find it difficult to defeat this level of strength. In fact, even when Miao, who could fight against the will of heaven and earth, would not have much of an advantage against this living creature. Of course, this was meaningless to Luo Fan. If he wanted to get rid of him, all he needed to do was crush him with a finger. "Don't worry, City Lord. Just do what you need to do." Luo Fan only smiled faintly. As he spoke, he grabbed with his hand, and the power of the surrounding space-time dimension condensed slightly. It condensed into a table and 3 stools that appeared behind him, Air Hostess Miao, and the other 2. There was no smoke or fire throughout the entire process. It was as if the space-time dimension had naturally condensed into tables and stools because of his arrival to welcome them. Before passing through the second catastrophe, Luo Fan would definitely not be able to use this method of using space-time dimensions. However, after passing through the second catastrophe, it was almost instinctive for him. Seeing this scene, the City Lord's pupils constricted. When he looked at Luo Fan, his gaze revealed a kind of solemnity that had not been there before. Even when Miao, who was at the side, looked at Luo Fan in shock. As an existence of a low space-time dimension, his use of space-time dimensions was actually so exquisite. This was simply subverting her worldview. Previously, the City Lord had wanted to take advantage of Luo Fan and leave him to the side. Now that he had witnessed Luo Fan's usage of space-time, how could he dare to do so? Immediately, he quickly put down his hand and put back the dimensional fragment he originally wanted to grab. Turning around, he respectfully bowed to Luo Fan and said, "Greetings, fellow Taoist. I am Inghua. May I know how to address fellow Taoist?" Luo Fan did not hide anything. He directly told the other party their names. After a short conversation, they finally got to know each other. After that, Luo Fan asked bluntly, "I have just come to this place. May I know if there is a method to transcend here?" Inghua sighed when he heard this. "Brother, you must be joking. Although I have heard that there is a method to transcend in this world, I do not know about it." Wen Miao's expression changed slightly. "City Lord, there is no method to transcend here? Isn't this city rather powerful? As the creator, how could you not know about the method to transcend?" Inghua could not help but feel a little awkward. "Even though I'm the City Lord of this city, I didn't establish this city. What?" Wen Miao exclaimed. Luo Fan could not help but frown. This situation was somewhat out of his expectations. For those who had attained eternal life, inheritances were not essential. Under normal circumstances, the person who created this city would not hand it over to others. "Since you are not the one who created this city, where is that expert now?" Luo Fan asked. "This city was created by my master. Several 100 million years ago, he handed this city over to me and said that he would leave to walk his path of transcendence. Ever since then, he has never returned." Inghua sighed. Path of transcendence. Wen Miao's expression changed. Then, did he leave any clues behind? Did he leave any clues behind? Where did he go to walk the path of transcendence? Inghua said, "Back then, my master left behind several books. He said that if I wanted to transcend one day, I could follow the books and seek transcendence. Unfortunately, I've always been afraid and didn't dare to take this path. I've disappointed Master." I wonder if I could take a look at the books? When Meow's eyes lit up, to her, transcendence was the same as returning home. Although she was a little disappointed that she did not obtain the method to transcend, she still had some clues. That was enough to tempt her. Ing Hua smiled and said, "It is naturally not a problem to hand the books over to you. I do not intend to take this path anyway, and it may not necessarily be a path." However, when Meow's expression changed slightly. After all, she wasn't someone who didn't understand the affairs of the world. She had trained in many different space-time dimensions. Even with the two Sky Ladies, she had trained for hundreds of millions of years in the world that Luo Fan had opened up. How could she not understand the intentions of the city Lord before her? "I can hand the books over to you, but what will you use to exchange for them?" "This is the guidance left behind by my master. Although it is not the true method of transcendence, it is still a wonderful item that points towards transcendence. How could I let you take it away for free?" "I wonder what the City Lord wants?" Luo Fan asked with a smile. To him, matter and energy were things that he could create at will. The only difference was the length of time he took to create them. Therefore, he was not worried that he would not be able to satisfy the City Lord's appetite. The range of the city is only a radius of 10 billion space-time dimensions. It is a little small. I wonder if you can expand it? The City Lord asked. Luo Fan and the others naturally knew what he meant. The range of the city was not something like a sphere of influence. Instead, it was the range of the space-time dimensional fragments that randomly fell from the sky. In other words, it was equivalent to the output of this courtyard. "I have never done this before. Do you know how to do it?" Luo Fan asked. Expanding this traction mechanism was not an unsolvable problem for Luo Fan. However, for Luo Fan, who had never studied this aspect at all, to solve this problem out of thin air, it would take him some time to deduce. He had to create it. This was obviously a waste of time. In comparison, if the other party had a method to provide him, he could use this method to execute it with his own strength, and the time and effort he would have to spend would naturally be much less than deducing it from nothing. The City Lord frowned slightly. Obviously, he did not expect that Luo Fan did not know the method. At that moment, he felt an inexplicable sense of contempt in his heart. However, very quickly, he recalled Luo Fan's absolutely terrifying strength and hurriedly put away his disdain. He said respectfully, "Of course there is. Please wait for a moment. Let me condense it." With that, he closed his eyes slightly. After a while, he raised his hand and pointed forward. A space-time dimensional fragment instantly burst out and condensed into a ball. It emitted an inexplicable light and fell into his hand. After condensing this space-time dimensional fragment, he heaved a sigh of relief and respectfully presented it to Wang Zhong. He sent it to Luo Fan and said, "The method is in here. Sorry to trouble you." Luo Fan raised his hand and waved. The fragment fell into his hand. With a thought, he found that the space-time dimensional fragment formed a mysterious state. It faintly contained a special concept that could not be put into words. That was obviously the method to expand the range of this city. With a thought, he carefully sensed the concept. After a while, Luo Fan had completely mastered that method. No wonder he couldn't perform it himself. After understanding that method, Luo Fan's heart moved. He already understood that the City Lord would not perform this method himself. Instead, it was the fundamental reason why he asked him to perform it. It was because of this expansion method. It required an existence at least at the level of a Supreme Emperor to be able to perform it. Moreover, the range that could be expanded was closely related to one's realm. If it was just an ordinary Supreme Emperor, which was a level 1 Supreme Emperor, then the range that could be expanded would probably be about the same as the range of this city at this moment. If one's strength reached the level of a level 2 Supreme Emperor, then the range of expansion would increase by 10 times. In other words, only an existence whose strength reached the level of a level 2 Supreme Emperor could once again expand the range of this city. Under such circumstances, the existence in front of him was only equivalent to a false saint. Of course, it was impossible for him to do this. Immediately, Luo Fan said, "I can expand it." Hearing this, Inghua was overjoyed and quickly thanked Luo Fan. Luo Fan did not hesitate and did not ask for the other party's reward first. He immediately began to modify the city's radiation mechanism according to the recorded method. He did not ask for the other party's reward first, because he was confident that even if the other party wanted to go back on his word, he would be able to suppress him. This was an absolute confidence. Inghua was not clear about this at first. There was doubt in his eyes, and he was in disbelief. However, he quickly understood what was going on, and his expression turned even more grave. Is he really that confident? While he was solemn, he was also a little indignant. Judging from the fact that he did not dare to step in even though he had obtained the clues to transcendence, one could tell what the city lord's temperament was like. The power of the city lord had already covered his heart of transcendence, his will of transcendence. For someone like him, it was inevitable that he would have a sense of pride and arrogance. With this thought, even though he knew that Luo Fan was stronger than him, deep down in his heart, he did not think that he would be helpless against Luo Fan. In his heart, he still felt that if they really fell out, he would still be able to splash blood on Yi Shiwen's face. With this mentality and this thought, he was naturally even more displeased with Luo Fan's attitude of looking down on him. However, he could not be bothered with the city lord's mentality. At this moment, with a thought, an indescribable power was released from his body. It started to connect with the ripples hidden behind the boundless space-time dimensions that originally existed in the city. In an instant, his body exuded a supreme aura. In a trance, the entire world seemed to be under his feet. The entire world seemed to be trembling under his feet. How is this possible? The city lord of Inghua's heart was filled with an indescribable fear. That was the only word he could think of. This was because his body was trembling uncontrollably. His life source was also trembling, as if it was enduring an unbearable pressure. It was about to collapse and be destroyed in the next moment. The arrogant thoughts he had earlier had long been thrown to the back of his mind. At this moment, he could clearly feel the huge gap between himself and Brother Luo Fan, who was by his side. At this moment, he finally realized how easy it was for Luo Fan to deal with him. How laughable was the confidence he had before. Am I really that weak? After those 4 words, a few more words appeared. A dejected thought gradually occupied his mind, gradually causing his aura to become inexplicably disheveled. Even his back seemed to become hunched. Chapter 1832. At this time, Luo Fan had already begun to activate the mechanism according to the expansion method. With the help of its changes, he began to inject his will into it, allowing the mechanism to continue to expand and cover a larger and larger area. At this moment, all the living beings in the city felt an indescribable pressure. This pressure was invisible and intangible. It directly affected their souls and naturally made them feel an indescribable sense of reverence. Due to this reverence, they could not help but look at the direction the pressure was directed at. In other words, it was at the center of the city, where the patio was located. In other words, it was where Luo Fan and the others were. This expansion was like a natural moat for the illustrious city lord. However, it was not enough to make Luo Fan feel any pressure. In just a few dozen breaths, he had expanded the mechanism to 10 times its original range. Vaguely, because he had exerted a little more force, he had even slightly exceeded the original number. At this moment, the patio suddenly shook. Then, with crackling sounds, hundreds of space-time dimensional fragments fell from it and smashed into the deep pit below. The various movements scared the illustrious city lord, who was standing at the side, awake. At first, he was confused, but soon, he was pleasantly surprised. "Thank you, Tao brother." He immediately stood up and bowed to Luo Fan. At this moment, Luo Fan had gradually retracted his will and released the mechanism. As he moved, the spiritual pressure that had started to spread in all directions gradually retracted. In the blink of an eye, it became invisible and disappeared without a trace. At this moment, only then did all the living beings in the city heave a sigh of relief and relax. However, due to the existence of this pressure, They also felt more reverence for the city lord. However, it also made them respect the city lord of this city even more. From then on, they were even more well-behaved than before. This could be considered an unexpected gain. Luo Fan was grateful to the illustrious city lord. However, he only smiled faintly and said, "There's no need to be so polite." The illustrious city lord also knew that this was an opportunity. At this moment, he hurriedly went to retrieve the clue of the Transcendence Path. After a short while, he had already sent a space-time dimensional fragment to Luo Fan. This fragment was much larger than the previous one. However, the light and shadow within it were much more blurry than the previous fragment. Looking at it, one could only vaguely see that the fog was constantly churning, but it was impossible to clearly see what was inside and what was recorded. However, the moment he received the fragment, Luo Fan knew that this fragment was at least condensed by a supreme emperor. It contained countless changes in the space-time dimension and recorded countless information through these changes. It was obvious that this was a much more sophisticated recording technique than the one used by the illustrious city lord. For an ordinary creature, it might take a lot of time to understand how to read this kind of more brilliant technique, but for Luo Fan, it was just a mystery that he could understand as soon as he learned it. Thus, his heart stirred slightly. With a slap of his hand, the information within was transformed into countless words that gushed out from the dimensional fragment. They turned into countless light and shadows in front of them. These light and shadows contained countless complicated changes and eventually formed a path that led to an unknown place and an unknown end. At this moment, the illustrious city lord muttered, "This is the Transcendence Path?" Looking at his expression, he seemed to be yearning and fearful. The complex emotions in his heart could be seen at a glance. A calm expression appeared on Luo Fan's face as he swept his gaze across the fragment. All the information was instantly absorbed into his heart. In the blink of an eye, he already knew where he should go. Not only did Luo Fan know where he should go, but the Air Maiden and Miao also looked enlightened. At this moment, they also had a look of realization on their faces. Although they didn't seem too strong in front of Luo Fan, both the Air Maiden and Miao were extremely powerful and terrifying existences. They could form an absolute suppression in any world. It could be said that in countless worlds, even the disciples of a true saint would be delusional if they didn't have a life-saving technique given by a true saint. How could they not see through the information that Luo Fan had displayed? Since we have obtained the information, we won't disturb the city lord any further. Goodbye. Luo Fan immediately stood up and said to the illustrious city lord. With that, he didn't care about the illustrious city lord's reaction. With a light stride, he brought the Air Maiden and Miao out of the city. In the blink of an eye, he had crossed countless space-time dimensions and arrived at an extremely mysterious place. This place was the intersection of a special space-time dimension in this world. There was no aura or any special changes at this intersection. It was in a special state of absolute balance. It was hidden among the endless space-time dimensions in this world, and it was almost impossible to find. Even for Luo Fan, if he didn't have the guidance of the ancient book, he would probably need a few days of deduction to find this location. Is this the location? Miao looked at the location with an indescribable excitement on her face as she murmured. Of course, she didn't say this to ask Luo Fan. After all, she had already analyzed the ancient book and knew that there was no mistake in this location. The reason why she murmured was because she had found the way home. She was a little excited and couldn't control herself. Luo Fan and the Air Maiden naturally knew how she felt. At this moment, they only smiled and didn't answer her nonsense. After a while, Miao said, "Let's go. We'll step on this path of transcendence and see if the end of the path is the higher space-time dimension." Luo Fan and the Air Maiden naturally nodded. In fact, it wasn't just Miao who was eager to step into the higher space-time dimension. Luo Fan and the Air Maiden were also quite curious about the situation of the higher space-time dimension. What kind of appearance did that space-time dimension have? What kind of creatures lived in it? What kind of scenery and what kind of special mysteries existed there? All of this was a great attraction for the two of them. Because of this, the two of them followed Meow to this space-time dimension and decisively stepped on this path of transcendence. The way to embark on this path was very simple. It was to enter the intersection of the space-time dimension. The three of them had different expressions as they stepped into that space-time dimension. In an instant, light and shadow changed, and space-time underwent all kinds of indescribable changes. They had already arrived in a strange space-time dimension. This space-time dimension was different from any other space-time dimension. Here, the changes in the space-time dimension were extremely weak. It felt as if the space-time dimension and the space-time dimension were completely frozen. Looking around, all he could see was a desolate void. It was so deep that people even suspected that there were countless strange creatures hidden in it. An inexplicable voice gradually grew louder and louder, gradually entering the ears of the three of them. This voice was extremely strange. They didn't know what creature was speaking, but it seemed to be a natural voice. However, such a creature, instead, it formed two words, transcendence. One voice after another continuously entered the ears of the three of them. As the voice became clearer and louder, the complicated emotions hidden in it also became more and more obvious. It was a kind of unwillingness, a kind of resistance, and a kind of deep despair. Luo Fan raised his eyes and glanced over. He instantly knew the source of the voice. This voice came from the birth of this world. It was the condensation of the deepest obsessions in the hearts of countless creatures who had embarked on this path of transcendence. It was the change caused by the deepest obsessions of those creatures in this space-time dimension. There are at least hundreds of millions of Supreme Emperors. The Air Maiden sighed. She also saw the source of these voices and even deduced them. Exactly how many creatures had embarked on this path to form such voices that could even affect the three of them? With so many creatures on this path, it should be possible, Meow said with some anticipation. Maybe. Luo Fan said indifferently at this time. This kind of thing was naturally uncertain. Who said that a path would definitely be possible if more people walked it? However, there was no need to add to Meow's troubles at this time. Hearing Luo Fan's words, Meow looked even more expectant. Immediately, the three of them set off and started moving forward. As for the direction they were moving in, it was needless to say, given their eyesight, how could they not see the traces of those creatures moving forward? How could they not see the other space-time dimension hidden in the depths of the void? After an unknown period of time, the three of them kept moving between space-time dimensional fragments. In the blink of an eye, it felt like thousands or even tens of thousands of years had passed. They finally met an expert who was walking on the same path as them. It was a level 3 Supreme Emperor. This Supreme Emperor was currently walking forward with a blank look in her eyes. Around her, countless lights and shadows were constantly changing. There was the flow of space-time, the growth of living things, and the transformation of countless space-time dimensions. It's a pity that she has completely lost herself. Luo Fan looked at this scene and sighed softly. A level 3 Supreme Emperor, no matter which world it was the highest level. But here, because she was searching for the path of transcendence, her heart and soul had completely sunk into the changes of the surrounding space-time dimensions, and she could no longer break free. One had to say that this was an inexplicable sorrow. Why is this happening? Meow asked worriedly. Naturally, she wasn't worried about this level 3 Supreme Emperor, although she was an extremely beautiful woman, and her appearance alone was enough to make people feel good about her. In reality, she was worried about the strangeness of this path. She was worried that this path wouldn't be able to lead them to a higher space-time dimension. She should have been walking on this path for billions of years, so long that she has completely lost all hope. Her heart and soul disintegrated in this despair, and she was completely swallowed by the changes of the surrounding space-time, becoming a living being within it. She went through reincarnation again and again. The Space Maiden sighed and said, "Reincarnation." Meow shuddered. The word reincarnation didn't sound like much. But the despair that it represented was enough to make any living being tremble. It represented that her memory was being destroyed again and again, and her past was being erased again and again. It also represented an endless sinking and the deepest despair. To her, this was even more unbearable than being completely destroyed. The three of them sighed and walked past this level 3 Supreme Emperor. They left this space-time dimensional fragment and stepped into a new one. Naturally, the lights and shadows in these space-time dimensional fragments couldn't all be the same as the dark void at the beginning. In fact, except for a few, the scenes inside each space-time dimensional fragment were extremely rich. They were basically like worlds with countless complex changes in space-time dimensions. Some were incomparably natural, some were incomparably bizarre. Some could even be traversed by ordinary mortals, while some could be traversed by supreme emperors. They could sink into it, and they would never be able to break through. When they saw the first expert who walked on the same path as them, they seemed to have finally stepped into the mainstream of this transcendence path. One expert after another appeared in front of them. Most of these experts had already lost their rationality because they had sunk into despair. Some were perplexed, some were crazy and ruthless, and they destroyed everywhere. But there were also many who were clear-headed, and they didn't give up hope and kept moving forward. Luo Fan and the others didn't show much of an abnormality. When they saw those living beings in despair, they didn't pay much attention to them. They directly passed by them and moved forward. When they encountered those who were crazy and wreaked havoc, they easily suppressed them. When they encountered those who were clear-headed, they didn't hesitate to communicate with them, and so on and so forth. After another few hundred years, they finally had a complete understanding of this transcendence path. They also finally understood how long this path was. This transcendence path followed the direction in which the space-time dimension fell. From the bottom to the top, they would reach the highest point of the countless space-time dimensions, the space-time dimension that would never fall or disappear. That space-time dimension was the higher space-time dimension that Miao and Luo Fan had mentioned. However, in the eyes of the many living beings who had embarked on this path, that was the immortal dimension. It was also known as the Primordial realm. The immortal dimension, the Primordial realm. When she heard this name, Miao felt proud, but her heart was inexplicably heavy. No world, no space-time dimension, nothing was absolutely perfect. As a living being born in the higher space-time dimension, Miao's understanding of the higher space-time dimension was naturally incomparable to that of other living beings. Therefore, she clearly knew that the higher space-time dimension wasn't much different from the lower space-time dimension, except for its higher intrinsic quality. There were also all kinds of ugliness, darkness, and strength and weakness. Such a space-time dimension, was it really worth it for the countless geniuses to spend billions of trillions of years to yearn for, to pursue, to the point of falling into despair in the end? Every time she thought of this, she would feel inexplicably irritated. One day, in a beautiful space-time dimension, Miao finally couldn't help but raise this question to Luo Fan. When Luo Fan heard this, he suddenly smiled and said, "So, this is what you've been worrying about these days." At this moment, the air hostess also couldn't help but smile and look at Miao with an indescribable expression. Miao was very dissatisfied when she saw this kind of reaction to her question. "I'm asking this question very seriously. Can you answer it seriously?" Luo Fan smiled and said, "That's right. For you, this might be a really big problem. In that case, let me explain it to you." At this moment, Miao stared closely at Luo Fan. She was indeed very concerned about the answer to this question that had been bothering her for hundreds of years. "What do you think cultivation is?" Luo Fan asked. "Cultivation is to improve oneself through various methods and promote the evolution of all aspects of oneself," Miao said directly. She was also a cultivator. She had been cultivating for hundreds of millions of years. How could she not have her own understanding of cultivation? Although this explanation was concise, it could be said to have explained the true essence of cultivation. Luo Fan nodded with a smile and said, "From a certain point of view, This sentence is correct. However, you've overlooked the most important point. That is, why do living beings cultivate instinctively? His words stunned Meow. She had never thought about this question. Any living being, whether it had spiritual intelligence or not, whether it had received an inheritance or not, would inevitably start the path of cultivation instinctively from the moment it was born. It would instinctively pursue to improve itself. She was well aware of this. However, she had never thought about why it was so. Luo Fan knew at a glance that she had never thought about this. He didn't keep her in suspense either. He sighed and said, "This is the instinct that all living beings have. It comes from breaking the shackles. It comes from transcending." These words made Meow's body tremble. Countless lights flashed in her eyes. In an instant, her whole soul seemed to have been sublimated. All kinds of indescribable enlightenment kept appearing in her heart. In a trance, she understood many things that she hadn't noticed before.